The widow stood at the station platform, rifle across her back, watching the eastbound train disgorge its cargo of dreamers and fools. She'd buried one husband already, wouldn't bury another. When the gentleman in the fine coat stepped down, all polish and propriety, Clara Vaughn knew immediately this one would break, or she would. The advertisement had promised her a working man. What arrived was something else entirely, a man running from ghosts she couldn't yet see. But out here, the land revealed everything. Welcome to a story of second chances born from first failures, where the Wyoming territory strips away every pretense and forces two broken souls to rebuild. Not just a ranch, but themselves. Stay with us until the very end to discover how a man who lost everything found the one thing worth keeping. And please, comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. Now, let's begin. The train's whistle cut through the April morning like a knife through silk, its mournful wail echoing across the endless Wyoming plains. Nathaniel Reed stood in the swaying passenger car, one gloved hand gripping the brass rail beside the door, the other clutching a leather satchel that contained everything he still owned in this world. Which wasn't much. 3 changes of clothes, a shaving kit, 2 books of poetry he couldn't bring himself to sell, and a single photograph he should have burned months ago. Through the soot-stained window, he watched the landscape transform from the last vestiges of civilization into something wild and unforgiving. The mountains in the distance stood like sentinels guarding secrets the East Coast would never understand. Out here, a man's past didn't matter as much as his willingness to work. At least, that's what he'd been told. That's what he desperately needed to believe. The conductor, a grizzled man with more wrinkles than teeth, moved through the car announcing stations. Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory. Watch your step, folks. Wind's got teeth today. Redemption Creek. The name felt like either a promise or a cruel joke. Nathaniel supposed he'd find out which soon enough. He descended the metal steps carefully, his city shoes slipping slightly on the dew-damp platform. The wind hit him immediately, not the gentle breezes of Boston's harbor, but something fierce and personal, carrying the scent of sage and distance and possibility. It tangled his dark hair and made his eyes water, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting it strip away the last remnants of the man he'd been. The station platform was nothing like the grand terminals back east, just weathered planks and a small building that looked like it might blow away in a strong gust. A handful of people milled about, ranch hands in dusty clothes, a family with wide-eyed children, a merchant examining crates being unloaded from the freight car, and her. Nathaniel saw her immediately, though she stood apart from the others, near the hitching post where 2 horses waited with the patience of creatures who knew their business. She wasn't what he'd expected. Not that he'd known quite what to expect from a widow rancher advertising for a husband through the mail, but somehow his imagination had conjured someone older, more weathered, perhaps desperate in a way that showed in her eyes. Clara Vaughn was none of those things. She stood maybe 5.5 feet tall, her frame lean and strong in a way that spoke of physical labor, rather than fashionable corsetry. Her dress was simple calico, faded from sun and washing, with split riding skirts that would have scandalized every woman in Nathaniel's former social circle. Her hair, the color of honey darkened by time, was pulled back in a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades. Her face was sun-touched, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes that could have come from either squinting at horizons or smiling at private jokes. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were the gray-blue of winter sky, and they assessed him with a directness that made him feel suddenly, acutely transparent. This was a woman who had learned to judge horseflesh, weather patterns, and the character of men with equal precision. A woman who had no time or patience for pretense. A rifle rested across her back, as natural as another woman might wear a shawl. She didn't move toward him, didn't smile or wave or show any of the nervous excitement one might expect from a woman meeting her mail-order husband for the first time. She simply stood there, waiting, letting him come to her, making him prove from the very first moment that he could meet her on her terms. Nathaniel picked up his satchel and crossed the platform. His shoes, fine leather things that had cost more than most men earned in a month, clicked against the wooden planks. Each step felt like walking toward either salvation or judgment, perhaps both. He stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat. The wind immediately tried to steal it, and he had to grab it back with an awkwardness that made him flush with embarrassment. "Mrs. Vaughn?" His voice came out rougher than intended, dried by train dust and trepidation. "Miss Vaughn now," she corrected, her voice carrying a subtle drawl that suggested she'd been out here long enough for the territory to seep into her speech. "Or just Clara. We don't stand much on formality out here, Mr. Reed." "Nathaniel," he offered, "if we're foregoing formality." She looked him over with the same careful attention she'd probably give a horse at auction. He felt every inadequacy of his appearance, the fine coat that marked him as city-bred, the soft hands that had never known real labor, the bearing that came from years of deportment lessons and society balls. He was as out of place here as a peacock in a henhouse, and they both knew it. "You're taller than I expected," she said finally. "The letter didn't mention that." "I'm afraid I don't know what the letter said. The agency handled all the correspondence." Something flickered in her eyes. Not quite suspicion, but close. "The agency." "Right. So you don't know what I'm looking for?" "A working man," Nathaniel said, echoing the phrase from the brief telegram he'd received in Denver. "Someone who'll stay. Someone who knows the value of land and honest labor." Clara's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That's a pretty way of putting it. What it means in plain terms is I need someone who can mend fence, birth calves, break horses, and not run for the hills when winter comes hard." "Can you do any of those things, Nathaniel Reed?" Honesty warred with desperation in his chest. He'd come too far to turn back now, spent his last real money on the train ticket and the agency's fee, but he'd also learned, in the hardest way possible, what happened when you built a life on lies. "No," he admitted, "but I can learn." She studied him for a long moment. Behind them, the train whistled again, preparing to depart. The sound felt like a door closing on his old life. "Why'd you leave?" she asked suddenly. "Man with clothes like that, speech like yours. You didn't grow up wanting to break your back on a Wyoming ranch. Something drove you out here. I need to know what." The photograph in his satchel seemed to burn like a coal. The memory of scandal, of whispered accusations and social doors slamming shut, of his father's face twisted with rage and disappointment. "I made mistakes," he said carefully. "Trusted the wrong people. My family's business was ruined, our name destroyed. I have nothing left back there." "Debts?" "All settled. I sold everything I could to make sure of that." "The law after you?" "No, ma'am. Nothing like that." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Woman trouble?" Heat crept up Nathaniel's neck. "In a manner of speaking. I was engaged. Her father was my father's business partner. When everything collapsed, she made it clear I was no longer a suitable match." "She break it off, or you?" "I did. Once I realized she'd known about her father's embezzlement all along." Something shifted in Clara's expression, some infinitesimal softening. "So you've got honor at least, or pride. Sometimes hard to tell the difference." She turned to the horses, running a hand along the neck of a sturdy paint mare. "This is Juniper. She's got more sense than most people I know. You ever ridden?" "Some. Recreational riding in the park. I'm sure it's not—" "It's not," Clara cut him off, but there was no mockery in her tone, just fact. "But if you're willing to learn, Juniper's patient. We'll start you on her." She gestured to the larger horse, a rangy buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes. "This is Prophet. He's mine. Don't try to ride him unless I say so, and don't ever approach him without speaking first. He doesn't like surprises." "Understood." Clara untied both horses and handed him Juniper's reins. "You know how to mount, at least." Nathaniel's recreational riding had involved expensive saddles and grooms to help mount. The stirrup on Juniper's well-worn saddle hung at a height he wasn't sure he could reach gracefully, but Clara was watching, and he'd rather break his neck than admit defeat in the first 5 minutes. He grabbed the saddle horn and the cantle, put his foot in the stirrup, and hauled himself up with more determination than skill. He made it into the saddle, though not gracefully, and Juniper shifted slightly, as if amused by his awkwardness. "You'll do," Clara said, which felt like the highest praise she was likely to offer. She swung onto Prophet with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since before she could walk. "It's an hour's ride to the ranch. Keep up, and if you start to fall, grab mane and hold on. Juniper won't bolt, but she won't stop for tears either." With that encouraging advice, Clara clicked her tongue and urged Prophet into an easy lope. Nathaniel's attempt to follow was less smooth. Juniper responded to his uncertain cues with tolerant patience, and they set off across the plains. The land stretched out before them in ways that made Nathaniel's chest tight. He'd thought he'd understood space, understood horizon, but Boston's concept of distance was a child's toy compared to this. The sky was impossibly vast, so big it seemed to curve at the edges, and the land rolled away in waves of grass and sage that went on forever. Mountains stood in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks still touched with snow despite the April warmth. For the first 15 minutes, Nathaniel focused entirely on staying in the saddle. Every muscle in his body protested this foreign activity. His thighs burned, his back ached, and he was fairly certain he was doing something fundamentally wrong with his hands, though he couldn't figure out what. Clara rode ahead, not looking back, as comfortable on horseback as most people were in their own kitchens. She sat the saddle with relaxed confidence, moving with the horse rather than fighting it. Nathaniel tried to emulate her posture and only succeeded in making himself more uncomfortable. They crested a rise, and Clara finally slowed, waiting for him to catch up. When Juniper drew alongside Prophet, Clara nodded toward the valley below. "The Vaughn Ranch," she said simply. The house sat in a fold of land where a creek cut through the valley, providing water and shelter from the worst winds. It was a sturdy structure of logs and stone, larger than a line shack but far from grand. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line. Beyond the house stood a barn, several corrals, and various outbuildings that Nathaniel couldn't immediately identify. Cattle grazed across the valley floor, and he could see sheep on the farther hillside, white dots against the green-gold grass. It was beautiful in a stark, practical way. Nothing like the manicured estates he'd known, with their gardens and fountains and architectural flourishes. This was a place carved from wilderness through sheer will and constant work. A place that demanded everything from its inhabitants and gave back only to those willing to pay the price. "Your late husband built this?" Nathaniel asked. Clara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We built it together, 15 years of work. Thomas died 3 winters ago, fell through creek ice checking on cattle, dead before I could get him back to the house." The flatness of her tone suggested she'd told this story before, had worn the sharp edges off the grief through repetition. But Nathaniel could hear the loss underneath, carefully buried but never quite gone. "I'm sorry." "So was I. Still am, some days." She nudged Prophet forward, starting down the slope. "But sorry doesn't feed cattle or mend fence. I've got 200 head of cattle, 50 sheep, 6 horses, and 300 acres that need working. Lost my 2 ranch hands to the silver mines last fall. They heard about the strike up in the mountains and figured they'd rather gamble on getting rich than break their backs for steady pay. Can't say I blame them, but it left me in a bind." "Couldn't you hire local men?" Clara's laugh was sharp and brief. "With what money? Ranch barely breaks even most years. And the men around here, the decent ones, are already working their own land. The rest—" She shook her head. "I tried hiring a few. One tried to force himself on me the first week. Another started stealing equipment to sell in town. The last one just disappeared one morning, took my best saddle with him. That's when I decided a husband might be the only way. A man's got more reason to stay if it's his land too." The brutal practicality of it struck Nathaniel silent. This wasn't romance or even companionship she'd been seeking. It was survival, pure and simple. She'd advertised for a husband the way another person might advertise for a hired hand, because out here, survival came before sentiment. "You're quiet," Clara observed as they approached the ranch house. "Having second thoughts?" "Just adjusting my expectations," Nathaniel said honestly. "Good. I don't believe in pretty lies, and I don't have time for hurt feelings. I need to know right now, you planning to run when the work gets hard?" He thought about what waited for him back east. Nothing. No family who'd claim him, no society that would receive him, no prospects worth the name. He'd burned those bridges so thoroughly there wasn't even ash left. But more than that, looking at this valley, at this hard-won piece of land, he felt something stir in his chest he hadn't felt in months. Purpose. The possibility of building something real. "I'm not running," he said. "I don't have anywhere to run to. But more than that, I don't want to run." I want to build something that lasts, something that can't be taken away by scandal or social whim or another man's greed. Clara studied him again with those winter sky eyes. Finally, she nodded. All right then, let's go see what you're made of. They rode into the ranch yard, and immediately Nathaniel heard barking. 3 dogs emerged from the barn, working dogs by the look of them, lean and alert. They circled Prophet and Juniper with professional interest, but didn't jump or bark with the enthusiastic chaos of pet dogs. That's Jack, Queen, and Ace, Clara said, dismounting with easy grace. They do more work than most men I've known. They'll warm up to you eventually if you prove worth warming up to. Nathaniel climbed down from Juniper far less gracefully, his legs nearly buckling when his feet hit the ground. Everything hurt in ways he hadn't imagined possible. Clara pretended not to notice his awkwardness as she led both horses toward the barn. Unsaddle Juniper, she instructed, showing him how to loosen the cinch and lift the saddle free. The saddle was heavier than it looked, and his arms trembled with the effort of carrying it to the saddle rack. Brush her down, check her hooves for stones, then turn her into the near corral with fresh water. Clara made it sound simple, but each task revealed new depths of his ignorance. He fumbled with the brush, uncertain of pressure and pattern. He had to ask for help with the hoof pick, having no idea how to convince a horse to lift its feet. Clara showed him with patience that surprised him, though she never did the work for him. You'll learn, she said as he finally released Juniper into the corral. Or you won't, and we'll find out quick either way. The house was as practical as everything else about Clara Vaughn. One large room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, dominated by a stone fireplace that would provide heat in the brutal Wyoming winters. A hallway led to what Nathaniel assumed were bedrooms. The furniture was handmade but well crafted, everything showing the wear of use but also the care of regular maintenance. A shelf held a few books, practical volumes on animal husbandry, weather patterns, and one worn Bible. Nothing decorative graced the walls except a single framed photograph of a young couple on their wedding day. The man was stocky and smiling. The woman, a younger Clara, looked serious even then, but there was softness in her eyes that Nathaniel hadn't yet seen in person. Clara caught him looking at the photograph. That's Thomas, she said quietly. He was a good man. Worked hard, never complained, knew the land like it was written in his bones. She moved to the stove, stoking the fire to life. I can't offer you love, Mr. Reed. Thomas took that with him when he died, and I've got nothing left to give in that regard. But I can offer you fair treatment, honest work, and a share in whatever this land produces. That enough for you? The question hung in the air between them. Nathaniel thought about the photograph in his satchel, about the woman who'd worn his ring and shared his bed until the moment his usefulness ended. That had been supposed love, dressed up in silk and promises, and it had shattered like glass the moment real trouble came. It's more than enough, he said. I'm not looking for romance, Mrs. Clara. I'm looking for a chance to prove I'm worth more than the circumstances that drove me here. Something flickered in Clara's eyes. Approval, maybe? Or just relief that he understood the terms. All right, then. I'll show you your room. We'll sign papers tomorrow in town, make it legal before the justice of the peace. Tonight you can rest from your journey. Tomorrow, the real work begins. She led him down the hallway to a small room that held a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. It was clean and spare, more than he'd expected, less than he'd once taken for granted. This was going to be, Clara paused, her hand on the doorframe. We were going to have children, but it never happened, and then Thomas died, and now it's just storage mostly. I cleared it out when I decided to advertise. It's yours now. The admission felt like a gift of trust, this glimpse into her private grief. Nathaniel set his satchel on the bed. Thank you. Clara nodded and turned away, then paused. One more thing. The rifle by the door, that's for wolves, coyotes, the occasional bear. I'll teach you to shoot because out here, everyone needs to know how. But if you ever, and I mean ever, point a gun at another person on this property, you'll answer to me. Understood? Understood. Good. Supper's in an hour. I'll expect you to help with evening chores after. Welcome to the Vaughn Ranch, Nathaniel Reed. She left him alone in the small room that smelled of cedar and dust and possibility. Nathaniel sat on the bed, feeling the rope springs creak beneath his weight, and pulled the photograph from his satchel. The woman staring back at him from the sepia tone seemed like a stranger now, her fashionable dress and calculated smile belonging to a world that had never been real. He thought about Clara's directness, the calluses on her hands, the way she'd assessed him like a tool she needed rather than a romantic prospect. There was a strange freedom in that honesty. No pretense, no games, no performance required beyond honest work. Outside his window, he could hear the lowing of cattle, the wind in the grass, the distant call of a hawk. Sounds he'd never heard from his Boston townhouse, where the noise was all human, carriages and voices, and the constant press of society. He took the photograph and tucked it under the mattress, out of sight. That life was done. Whatever happened next, whoever he became in this wild territory, would be built on sweat and skill rather than social standing. The sun was lowering toward the mountains when Clara called him for chores. His body still ached from the ride, but he pulled on his coat and stepped out into the cooling evening air. Clara stood by the barn, a bucket in each hand. Cattle need checking, horses need feeding, chickens need shutting in for the night. We'll start with the easy stuff and work up to the skills that take learning. You ready? Nathaniel looked at her standing there in the golden light, practical and unadorned and more real than anyone he'd ever known. Behind her, the land stretched away into shadow and possibility. I'm ready, he said, and the work began. The first night, Nathaniel fell into bed with muscles screaming protests he'd never imagined possible. Simple tasks, carrying water buckets, forking hay, herding chickens into their coop, had exposed every inadequacy of his genteel upbringing. His hands, soft from years of pen pushing and glove wearing, had blistered within the first hour. Clara had noticed, said nothing, and simply handed him a tin of salve after supper with instructions to apply it before sleeping. That salve became his salvation over the following days as his body warred with the brutal requirements of ranch work. He woke before dawn to Clara's knock on his door, a sound both insistent and impersonal, and stumbled into the cold darkness to begin chores he was only beginning to understand. Coffee's on the stove, Clara would say, already dressed and moving with purpose. Drink fast. Cattle won't wait for you to feel human. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter and scalding, and Nathaniel learned to drink it black because asking for sugar felt like admitting weakness. He'd watch Clara move through the pre-dawn routine with economical grace, pulling on her worn boots, checking the rifle by the door, braiding her hair with quick practiced movements that spoke of thousands of identical mornings. You coming or just decorating the doorway? She'd ask without looking at him, and he'd grab his own coat and follow her into the darkness. The cattle needed checking every morning, a task that involved riding the fence line to ensure none had wandered or been taken by predators during the night. Nathaniel's riding improved through sheer necessity, though he suspected Juniper deserved more credit than his skill. The mare seemed to understand his incompetence and compensated for it, following Prophet without requiring much guidance. See that? Clara pointed to tracks in the soft earth near the creek. Wolf, big one. Came through last night, probably testing the fence. Nathaniel saw only disturbed dirt, but he nodded as if he understood. Wolves are smart, Clara continued, scanning the surrounding hills with eyes that missed nothing. They'll probe for weakness, find the sick or injured cattle. That's why we ride every morning. Show them we're watching. Do you have to shoot them often? Often enough. I don't kill for sport, but I kill to protect what's mine. Out here, that's just the cost of survival. She glanced at him, assessing something in his expression. That bother you? No, Nathaniel said honestly. Everything has a cost. I'm learning that. Something flickered in Clara's face. Not quite approval, but close. She urged Prophet forward, and Nathaniel followed, trying to commit every detail to memory. Which plants the cattle favored, where water pooled after rain, how to read the sky for coming weather. Clara taught through example rather than lecture, expecting him to observe and learn or fail and suffer the consequences. On the third morning, she handed him a coiled rope. Time you learn to use this. Can't work cattle without knowing how to rope. The lasso felt foreign in his hands, the weight and balance unlike anything he'd handled before. Clara demonstrated with casual expertise, her loop sailing out to settle around a fence post with perfect precision. Your turn. Nathaniel's first attempt tangled around his own legs. His second hit the ground 3 feet short of the target. His third, fourth, and fifth weren't much better. Clara watched without comment, letting him struggle, and only when he'd exhausted himself with failure did she step in. "You're thinking too much," she said, positioning herself behind him and guiding his hands through the motion. Her touch was impersonal, instructional, but Nathaniel felt suddenly aware of her proximity, the scent of soap and leather, the strength in her calloused hands. "Feel the rope, don't force it. Let the motion come from your whole body, not just your arm." She stepped back and he tried again. This time the loop sailed out straighter, though it still fell short of the post. "Better," Clara said. "Practice every morning until it's natural. You'll need it." That became his routine. Morning chores, breakfast of whatever Clara had prepared, usually biscuits and gravy, eggs when the chickens were generous, occasionally bacon from their small smokehouse. Then the real work of the day, which varied with need and season. Mending fence, moving cattle, checking sheep for signs of disease, repairing equipment that constantly broke under the strain of hard use. Every task exposed new ignorance. Nathaniel had never understood how many small skills comprised ranch work, how much knowledge was required just to keep livestock alive and infrastructure functional. He learned to splice rope, treat minor wounds on animals, recognize the signs of good grass versus poor. He learned that cattle were mostly stupid, but occasionally cunning, that sheep were perpetually suicidal, and that horses possessed more personality than most people he'd known in Boston. "Why'd you name them Jack, Queen, and Ace?" he asked one evening as they worked together to repair a section of corral fence. The dogs lay nearby, watching with professional interest. Clara didn't look up from the post she was setting. "Thomas named them. He was a card player before we married, made his stake in a poker game in Denver. Said these three were his real winning hand, worth more than any cards." Her mouth quirked slightly. He wasn't wrong. Jack's got the best nose for tracking I've ever seen. Queen's the smartest. She can work cattle or sheep, makes the decisions when I'm not close enough to direct. Ace is the enforcer, keeps the other animals in line. They're remarkable. They're working dogs. That's what they're bred for. But he heard the affection underneath her practical tone. These animals were partners in survival, not pets, but that didn't mean she didn't value them. The fence repair took until dusk. Nathaniel's hands bled from splinters despite the gloves Clara had provided. Work gloves, rough leather things that fit poorly but offered some protection. He tried to hide the blood, but Clara saw everything. "Let me see," she demanded when they'd finally finished. He held out his hands reluctantly. Several splinters remained embedded in his palms, surrounded by inflamed skin. Clara fetched her kit without a word, the same practical bag she used for livestock injuries. She worked in the fading light, her touch surprisingly gentle as she extracted each splinter with tweezers and cleaned the wounds with something that burned like liquid fire. "This is going to keep happening," she said matter-of-factly. "Your hands need to toughen up. Until they do, you'll hurt." "I'm not complaining." "No, you're not." She looked at him directly for the first time all day. Really looked at him rather than through him. "I expected you to quit by now. Most men from your background would have." "What makes you think I'm from any particular background?" Clara's smile was slight but genuine. "Please. The way you talk, the way you hold yourself even when you're exhausted, those clothes you arrived in, you might as well have worn a sign saying Boston Gentleman. I'm not stupid, Nathaniel Reed. I know you're running from something. I just don't care what, as long as you keep working." The honesty deserved honesty in return. "My father owned a shipping company," Nathaniel said quietly. "His partner embezzled everything, left us with nothing but debts and scandal. My engagement ended, my family's social standing evaporated, and my father, he died of a heart attack before the courts finished their investigation. I sold everything we had left to settle the debts because the law wouldn't hold me responsible, but I would. That's who I was running from. Myself, I suppose. The man who was too blind to see what was happening until it was too late." Clara finished bandaging his hands in silence. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd yet heard it. "Thomas and I, we came out here with nothing. Built this place from scratch because we were too stubborn to fail. The land doesn't care about your past, Nathaniel. It only cares about today's work and tomorrow's survival. You keep that in mind, you might actually make it." The following Saturday, they rode into Redemption Creek for supplies and to sign the marriage papers. The town was barely worthy of the name, a single street with a general store, saloon, church, and handful of other buildings that served the scattered ranching community. People watched as they rode in, curiosity naked on their faces. "Don't mind them," Clara said quietly. "Small towns live on gossip. By tomorrow, everyone will know I married some Eastern gentleman. They'll have opinions." "Will it cause you trouble?" "I stopped caring about other people's opinions when Thomas died, and half the town thought I should sell the ranch and move back east to live with relatives." Her jaw set in that stubborn line he was learning to recognize. "I built that place. It's mine. Anyone who doesn't like my choices can go to hell." The justice of the peace was a dried-up stick of a man named Hutchins who ran the general store when he wasn't officiating weddings and settling disputes. He looked Nathaniel up and down with undisguised skepticism. "You sure about this, Clara? Man looks like he'd blow away in a stiff wind." "He's stronger than he looks," Clara said, and Nathaniel felt an absurd flush of pride at her defense. "Can we get on with it? We've got supplies to buy and a long ride home." The ceremony took perhaps 5 minutes. No flowers, no witnesses beyond Hutchins' wife, who was called in from the store, no romance whatsoever. They signed papers, exchanged no rings, spoke vows that were purely legal rather than emotional. When Hutchins pronounced them married, Clara didn't offer her lips for a kiss, and Nathaniel didn't presume to try. They shook hands instead, a business transaction concluded. "Congratulations," Hutchins said dryly. "May you both prosper, or at least not kill each other before spring." In the general store, Clara moved through her supply list with practiced efficiency. Flour, salt, sugar, coffee, ammunition, lamp oil, a few other necessities. Nathaniel noticed her counting coins carefully, making decisions about what could wait until next month. The ranch might be hers, but money was clearly tight. "Add those," he said quietly, gesturing to a few items she'd passed over. A better grade of coffee, a tin of peaches, some peppermint sticks. Clara frowned. "That's not necessary. Consider it a wedding present. I have a little money left. Not much, but enough for small luxuries." For a moment he thought she'd refuse out of pride. Then her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "All right, thank you." At the counter, Hutchins' wife, a plump woman with kind eyes, smiled at them. "It's good to see you settling down again, Clara. You've been alone too long." "I haven't been alone," Clara corrected. "I've been working. There's a difference." "Still, a ranch needs more than one pair of hands." She looked at Nathaniel with the same assessing gaze everyone in town seemed to possess. "You know anything about ranching, young man?" "I'm learning, ma'am." "That's honest, at least. You'll need honesty more than anything out here. That and a strong back." She wrapped their purchases in brown paper, her movements quick and efficient. "Clara's good people, but she doesn't suffer fools. You treat her right." "I intend to." On the ride back, loaded down with supplies, Clara was quieter than usual. Nathaniel let the silence stretch, watching the play of late afternoon light across the grass. The land looked different now than it had a week ago. Less alien, more like something he was beginning to understand, even if he hadn't mastered it. "Thank you," Clara said suddenly, "for the extras, and for not making a fuss about the wedding." "Were you expecting me to?" "I don't know what I was expecting." She adjusted her grip on Prophet's reins, her eyes on the horizon. "Thomas and I, we married for love. Young and stupid and convinced that was enough. Turned out love and hard work together made something strong. But I don't have love to offer anymore, Nathaniel. I need you to know that's not changing." "I understand." "Do you?" She glanced at him, vulnerability showing for just a moment before she locked it away again. "Because I've seen men think they can change a woman's mind through persistence or charm or just being patient. I'm telling you now, my heart's buried with Thomas. This is a business arrangement that happens to have legal papers. That's all it can be." Nathaniel thought about his engagement, about the woman who'd claimed to love him until the money disappeared, about the society that had embraced him until scandal struck, about the father who'd died still disappointed in his son's blindness. "I spent years in a world where everyone performed emotions they didn't feel," he said carefully. "Where love was declared freely but meant nothing when tested. You're offering me honesty, Clara. That's worth more than pretty lies wrapped in romance. I won't pretend I'm not grateful for the chance you've given me, but I won't pretend it's something it isn't." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right then. We understand each other. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when they arrived at the ranch, they worked together to unload supplies and settle the horses with the easy coordination of people learning each other's rhythms. It wasn't romance, wasn't the dramatic passion of novels or poetry, but it was real, and it was honest. And Nathaniel found himself valuing that more than he'd expected. That night, after supper, Clara pulled out a ledger and spread it on the table. You're part owner now. Might as well understand what you've gotten yourself into. The numbers told a stark story. The ranch survived, but barely. Every season was a gamble against weather, predators, disease, and market prices in distant cities. Clara had managed to hold on through Thomas's death in 2 years alone, but the margins were thin. One bad winter, one disease outbreak, one significant equipment failure could destroy everything. Why sheep and cattle both? Nathaniel asked, studying the figures. Wouldn't specializing be more efficient? Diversification is survival out here. Cattle prices drop, sheep pick up the slack. Drought hits, sheep can survive on rougher forage than cattle. Plus the wool provides income in winter when we're not selling meat. She tapped the ledger with her pencil. Thomas figured that out our 3rd year when cattle prices crashed. The sheep saved us. It's brilliant, actually. Risky, but brilliant. Clara looked surprised. You understand finance. I managed my father's accounts before, he gestured vaguely, before everything collapsed. I'm good with numbers, if nothing else. Something shifted in Clara's expression. Interest, maybe even respect. Then you can take over the books. I hate doing them, always have. If you can find ways to stretch our dollars further, I'm listening. They spent the next 2 hours going over every expense, every income stream, every debt and asset. Nathaniel found himself engaged in a way he hadn't been in months, his mind working through problems that had actual consequences rather than the abstract financial maneuvering of his father's business. Clara proved quick with numbers once she was freed from the tedium of recording them, offering insights about ranch operations that shaped his understanding of what was possible. We could cut costs here, he said, pointing to the feed expenses. If we planted our own grain instead of buying it, the initial investment would pay off within 2 seasons. Need equipment for that. Plow, harrow, seed. Don't have the capital. What if we started small? Use hand tools, plant just enough for the horses' first year. Expand as we can afford. Clara considered it, her pencil tapping against her teeth. That could work. Be backbreaking labor, though. Everything here is backbreaking labor. Might as well break our backs doing something that saves money. She laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face. You're starting to think like a rancher. That's either very good or very dangerous. The days folded into weeks, each one building Nathaniel's competence through small increments and painful lessons. He learned to read cattle behavior, to anticipate when a cow was about to bolt or a calf was sick. He learned to mend harness with borrowed needle and strong thread, to sharpen tools on the whetstone until edges gleamed, to judge the weather by the way clouds moved across the mountains. His hands grew calloused, his shoulders strengthened, his soft city muscles transformed slowly into something harder and more useful. The blisters that had plagued his first week became memory, replaced by tough skin that could handle rough work. He learned to move like Clara moved, economically, preserving energy for the long days that stretched from before dawn until after dark. But it was the roping that frustrated him most. Every morning he practiced, throwing loop after loop at fence posts, barrels, anything that would hold still. His accuracy improved marginally, but he was nowhere near the casual competence Clara displayed. You're still thinking, she observed one morning, watching him miss yet another throw. You're treating it like a math problem you can solve with logic. Everything is a math problem at some level. Not this. This is about feel, instinct. You need to stop calculating angles and just let your body know what to do. She took the rope from him, demonstrated again. Watch. I'm not thinking about where the loop needs to go. I'm seeing it there, and my hands make it happen. That's not helpful advice. It's the only advice that matters. She handed the rope back. Try again. But this time don't think about the post. Think about the rope settling around it, already done. Nathaniel tried, visualizing success instead of mechanics. The loop sailed out and actually brushed the post before falling away. Better, Clara said. Keep practicing. It'll come. It came slowly, imperfectly, but it came. By the end of his third week, he could rope a stationary target more often than not. Moving targets remained beyond him, but Clara seemed satisfied with the progress. Good enough to be useful, she declared. Tomorrow we start working cattle for real. Time to see if you can apply all this learning to actual animals. That night, Nathaniel lay in his narrow bed, every muscle aching in the familiar way that meant he'd worked hard and honestly. Through the walls, he could hear Clara moving in her own room, preparing for bed with the same efficient routine she brought to everything. They lived under the same roof, shared meals and labor, but maintained careful distance. She was his wife on paper, his employer in practice, and something more complex in reality, a partner in survival who'd learned to trust his work, if not his heart. He thought about the life he'd left behind, the elegant parties and social maneuvering, the business dealings and polite fictions. That world seemed impossibly distant now, almost imaginary. Out here, under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, life was simpler even if it was harder. Your work mattered or it didn't. You contributed or you failed. The land didn't care about your family name or social connections. The land only cared if you could survive it. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of day that promised hard weather later. Clara was already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee with quick, practiced movements. "Storm's coming," she said without preamble. "We need to move the cattle to lower pasture before it hits. This time of year, spring storms can turn deadly fast." They rode out at first light, the dogs ranging ahead with purposeful energy. The cattle were scattered across the upper valley, grazing on new grass that had come with the April warmth. Getting them moving required strategy and patience, skills Nathaniel was still developing. "Don't chase them," Clara instructed. "Guide them. Use Prophet's position to suggest direction, not force it. Cattle are herd animals. Get a few moving the right way, the rest will follow." In theory, it sounded simple. In practice, cattle proved remarkably stubborn about moving in any direction they hadn't personally chosen. Nathaniel spent the first hour learning this lesson repeatedly, as cows simply walked around him or stopped to stare with bovine indifference. Clara worked the other side of the herd with Jack and Queen, her movements precise and minimal. She'd position Prophet just so, and the cattle would flow around her like water around a stone, moving gradually toward the lower valley, without seeming to realize they were being herded. It was beautiful to watch, the communication between horse, dogs, and handler so seamless it seemed like telepathy. "Stop trying to dominate them," Clara called across the herd. "You're partners in this, not adversaries." Nathaniel took a breath, forced himself to relax. He thought about what Clara had said about roping, feel instead of calculation. He stopped trying to force the cattle and started suggesting, using Juniper's position to indicate direction rather than demand it. Slowly, grudgingly, the cattle near him began to drift toward the rest of the herd. "Better," Clara's approval carried across the distance. It took 3 hours to move the herd to lower ground, work complicated by several calves who kept trying to return to their previous grazing spots. By the time they had the cattle settled in the more sheltered valley, Nathaniel was exhausted and sweating despite the cool air. "Look," Clara said, pointing to the mountains. Clouds were building behind the peaks, dark and heavy with the kind of violence that turned spring rain deadly. Lightning flickered in their depths, too distant to hear but close enough to see. "We need to get back to the house," she said urgently. "These storms move fast." They rode hard, pushing the horses in ways Clara never normally did. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and electricity. Behind them, the sky darkened rapidly, clouds boiling over the mountains like something alive and angry. They made it to the ranch with perhaps 20 minutes to spare. Together they moved with practiced urgency, horses unsaddled and into the barn, chickens secured, equipment brought under cover, shutters closed and latched. Clara worked with the efficiency of someone who'd weathered countless storms, and Nathaniel tried to match her pace. The first drops hit like thrown stones, hard enough to sting. Then the sky simply opened, rain falling so thick and fast it was hard to breathe. Lightning cracked close enough to feel in their bones, and thunder rolled across the valley like artillery. "Inside!" Clara grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the house. They burst through the door just as hail began to fall, chunks of ice the size of hens' eggs that would have split their skulls if they'd been caught outside. Nathaniel stood dripping in the main room, his heart racing from the sprint and the primal fear of the storm's violence. Clara was already moving, lighting lamps against the premature darkness, checking windows for leaks, preparing for the long wait. "Coffee?" she asked, as calm as if they hadn't just barely escaped injury. "Please." They sat at the table while the storm raged outside, the house creaking under the assault but holding firm. The roof leaked in one corner, a slow drip into a strategically placed bucket that suggested this was a familiar problem. "Thomas kept meaning to fix that," Clara said quietly, watching the drip. "Never got around to it." "I'll fix it," Nathaniel said, "when the weather clears. Add it to my list of skills to learn." Clara smiled slightly. "That list is getting long." "Good. Keeps me too busy to think about anything else." They sat in companionable silence as the storm battered the valley. The violence outside made the house feel smaller, more intimate. For the first time since arriving, Nathaniel felt truly aware of being alone with Clara, not working together, not moving through routines, but simply existing in the same space with nothing but time and weather between them. "Thank you," Clara said suddenly. "For today, for every day, really. You've worked harder than I expected, complained less than I would have. I've had men with years of experience who couldn't match your determination. I'm just trying not to prove you made a mistake. You're doing more than that." She met his eyes directly, a rare moment of unguarded honesty. "You're earning your place here. That matters more than you know." The storm lasted through the afternoon and into the evening, pinning them inside with nothing to do but wait. They played cards with a worn deck Clara produced from a drawer, simple games that required little concentration. She won more often than not, but Nathaniel suspected she was better at reading people than he was at hiding his hand. "Thomas taught me," she said, dealing another round. "Said a rancher's wife needed to know how to spot a bluff. Came in handy more than once when selling cattle. Could tell when a buyer was lying about his price." "You miss him." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "Every day, but missing him doesn't bring him back, and the ranch doesn't run on grief. So I work, and I survive, and I hope that somewhere he knows I kept his dream alive. I think he'd be proud of what you've built." "He'd be irritated I didn't fix the damn roof," Clara said, but her eyes were soft with memory. The storm finally broke near sunset, the clouds parting to reveal a sky washed clean and impossibly blue. They stepped outside to assess damage, a few broken branches, some scattered equipment, nothing catastrophic. The cattle were visible in the distance, clustered together but unharmed. The land itself seemed refreshed, the grass greener for the moisture. "Could have been worse," Clara said, surveying her property with satisfaction. "Could have been a lot worse." They worked together in the wet evening air to clean up storm debris, their movements synchronized by weeks of shared labor. And as the sun set behind the mountains in spectacular colors that no painter could capture, Nathaniel realized he was smiling. This hard place, this difficult life, this woman who demanded excellence and gave respect in return, he was happy. Not the shallow pleasure of his old life, but something deeper and more solid. The satisfaction of work well done, of challenges met, of building something real with his own hands. Clara caught his expression and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing, just, I'm glad I came here. Glad you gave me this chance." She studied him in the fading light, then nodded once. "I'm glad you stayed. Come on, we've got supper to make, and tomorrow comes early." They walked back to the house together, partners in survival, and the future stretched before them like the Wyoming plains, vast, uncertain, and full of promise. Spring deepened into early summer, and with it came the true test of Nathaniel's transformation. The calving season hit with relentless intensity, demanding round-the-clock vigilance as cows gave birth across the valley. Some births went smoothly, the calves dropping into the grass and finding their feet within minutes. Others required intervention that left Nathaniel's arms aching and his heart racing with the primal fear of loss. "This one's breech," Clara said tersely one midnight, her hand inside a laboring cow that had been struggling for hours. "I need you to hold her steady while I turn the calf." Nathaniel gripped the cow's halter, murmuring nonsense words of comfort while the animal bellowed her distress. Clara worked with focused intensity, her face tight with concentration as she manipulated the unborn calf into position. Minutes stretched like hours, and Nathaniel could see the strain in Clara's shoulders, the sweat beading her forehead despite the cool night air. "Come on," Clara muttered, more to herself than anyone. "Come on, little one. Work with me here." The cow groaned, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her bones. Clara pulled, steady and careful, and suddenly there was movement, a rush of fluid, and then the calf, slick and steaming in the lantern light. It lay motionless for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. "No," Clara breathed, dropping to her knees beside the calf. She cleared its nose and mouth, rubbed its chest vigorously with handfuls of straw. "Breathe, damn you, breathe." Nathaniel watched helplessly, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. This tiny creature, born into darkness and struggle, seemed impossibly fragile. How did anything survive in this harsh place? Clara bent down, blowing air into the calf's nostrils in a desperate attempt to trigger respiration. Once, twice, 3 times. The calf's chest heaved suddenly, a shuddering gasp that turned into a weak but definite breath. Then another. Its eyes opened, dark and bewildered, and it made a small sound that brought its mother's head around immediately. "There you are," Clara said softly, sitting back on her heels. "Knew you had fight in you." The cow began licking her calf with long, careful strokes, and within minutes the little one was struggling to rise on impossibly spindly legs. Nathaniel felt something crack open in his chest, joy mixed with relief, pride in Clara's skill, wonder at the stubborn persistence of life. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Clara corrected, standing and wiping her hands on her already filthy apron. "You held her steady, kept her calm. That matters." She looked at him in the lantern light, her eyes reflecting something warm. "You're good at this, Nathaniel. The animals trust you." The praise, simple and honest, meant more than any compliment he'd received in his former life. This wasn't empty flattery from people who wanted something from him. This was recognition earned through sweat and effort, acknowledgement from someone who had no reason to lie. They walked back to the house as dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The valley was coming alive with birdsong, and the air smelled of dew and new grass. Nathaniel was exhausted, filthy, and happier than he'd been in years. "Coffee and breakfast," Clara said, pushing open the door. "Then maybe 2 hours of sleep before we need to check the south pasture." "You're not even human," Nathaniel said, but he was smiling. "I'm a rancher. Same thing." They moved through the morning routine with the ease of long practice, and as Nathaniel finally collapsed into his bed for a brief rest, he could hear Clara already outside again, her voice calling to the dogs. The woman seemed to run on determination and coffee, with sleep somewhere far down her list of priorities. But the calving season also brought trouble in forms both expected and surprising. Predators, drawn by the scent of vulnerable newborns, began testing the ranch's defenses with increasing boldness. Nathaniel learned to sleep light, waking at the slightest unusual sound and grabbing the rifle Clara had taught him to use with grudging competence. One night, the dog's frantic barking brought them both running from the house to find a wolf circling the cattle pen, its eyes reflecting green in the lamplight. It was massive, bigger than any dog, with frost-colored fur and an intelligence in its gaze that was somehow worse than simple animal hunger. "Get behind me," Clara ordered, raising her rifle with practiced ease. But Nathaniel had his own rifle now, and he'd been practicing as diligently with it as he had with the lasso. He took position beside her instead of behind, and when the wolf shifted its weight to spring, he fired. The shot went wide. He was still no marksman, but it was close enough to make the wolf reconsider. Clara's follow-up shot hit the dirt directly in front of the creature, and that was enough. The wolf melted back into the darkness, its departure so swift and silent it seemed almost supernatural. "You missed," Clara observed. "I was aiming to scare it off. You said you don't kill unless necessary." She looked at him with something that might have been approval. "Good judgment. That wolf wasn't desperate yet, just testing. We scared it enough to move on to easier prey, but if it comes back, we'll have to finish it." "I understand." They stood together in the darkness, listening to the settling sounds of frightened cattle and the dog's continued vigilance. The night pressed around them, vast and full of hidden life, and Nathaniel felt acutely aware of how small the ranch was in comparison, a tiny island of human order in an ocean of wilderness. "You've changed," Clara said quietly, not looking at him. "When you first arrived, I gave you maybe 2 weeks before you'd break. But you didn't. You just kept working, kept learning. Why?" "Because I have nowhere else to go isn't a good enough answer anymore," Nathaniel said slowly, working through thoughts he'd been avoiding examining too closely. I think I was looking for something real. My whole life was performance, saying the right things, wearing the right clothes, making the right connections. Nothing actually mattered. But this?" He gestured at the ranch, the land, the life they were building. "This matters. What we do here has consequence. If we work hard, the ranch survives. If we fail, it dies. There's honesty in that." Clara was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "Thomas used to say something similar. That's why he left Denver, left the card tables and easy money. He wanted to build something that couldn't be lost in a single bad hand." She paused. "I think he'd like you. You're different from him in most ways, but that core thing, that need for honest work, he'd recognize that." It was perhaps the highest compliment she could offer, this comparison to the husband she still mourned. Nathaniel felt the weight of it, the responsibility of living up to a dead man's memory. "I hope I can earn that comparison," he said softly. They returned to the house as the first hints of dawn touched the mountains, and this time when they parted for their separate rooms, something had shifted between them. Not romance, Clara had been clear about that, but deepening respect, growing trust, the foundation of partnership that went beyond their legal arrangement. The days that followed brought new challenges that tested everything Nathaniel had learned. A fence break in the north pasture required emergency repairs in driving rain. 3 sheep developed some kind of respiratory infection that had Clara dosing them with medicines she mixed from ingredients in her medical kit, explaining the process so Nathaniel could help with the next crisis. A wildfire started on the neighboring property, and they spent 16 hours helping fight it before the wind finally shifted and pushed it back on itself. Through it all, Nathaniel worked alongside Clara with increasing competence. His roping improved until he could catch a moving calf more often than not. His riding became natural enough that he could focus on the work rather than simply staying in the saddle. His hands, thoroughly calloused now, could splice rope or mend harness without conscious thought. But it was the land itself that taught him the deepest lessons. He learned to read the subtle signs of changing weather in the behavior of animals and the smell of the wind. He learned which plants were good forage and which were poison, which areas held water after rain and which dried out within days. He learned the rhythms of the seasons, the way light changed as summer approached, the sounds that meant peace and the sounds that meant trouble. One evening in early June, they stood together on a rise overlooking the valley, watching the cattle graze peacefully in the long light. The grass was lush from spring rains, the creek ran full and clear, and the mountains stood purple against a sky still bright with day. "This is what Thomas and I dreamed of," Clara said softly. "When we first came out here with nothing but ambition and stupidity, this is what we imagined. Land that could sustain us, animals healthy and multiplying, a place that was truly ours." She glanced at Nathaniel. "He didn't live to see it fully realized, but you have. You've helped make this dream real. I'm just one more pair of hands. You're more than that." Clara turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "I need to tell you something. The bank's been pressuring me about the mortgage. Thomas took it out to buy more cattle 3 years ago, and I've been barely keeping up with payments. They've given me until August to pay it off in full, or they're taking the ranch." The words hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. "How much?" $800. It might as well have been 8,000. That sum represented more cash than the ranch generated in profit over multiple years. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I was hoping I wouldn't have to. I've been selling off breeding stock, taking on extra work where I can find it, squeezing every penny. But I'm not going to make it, Nathaniel. I'm going to lose everything Thomas and I built." Her voice remained steady, but he could see the devastation in her eyes. "I married you thinking an extra worker might increase profits enough to save us. But the market's been down, we've had losses, and I'm out of time. Nathaniel's mind raced through possibilities, calculations, desperate schemes. What if we sell more cattle, take them to market early? Prices are terrible right now. We'd get maybe half what they're worth, and we'd cripple our breeding program for years. It's not sustainable. The sheep, then? The wool? Already sold everything we produced this spring. It wasn't enough. Clara's shoulders sagged slightly, a rare show of defeat. I wanted to tell you before the bank sends someone out. You should know what you're facing. If we lose the ranch, you're free of this arrangement. I released you from nothing, but you also owe me nothing. You can walk away. Walk away? Nathaniel stared at her. You think I'd abandon you? Abandon this place? You have no reason to stay if there's no ranch. I have every reason. The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended, surprising them both. Clara, this is my home now. The only real home I've ever had. These months here, this work, this life, it's the first time I've felt like I mattered, like I was building something real. You think I'd just walk away from that? Clara's eyes glistened suspiciously, but her voice remained controlled. Noble sentiments don't pay bank debts. No, but maybe I can. Nathaniel's thoughts were racing now, pieces clicking together. Before I left Boston, I sold everything. Most of it went to creditors, but there was one thing I kept, my mother's jewelry. I couldn't bring myself to sell it because it was the last thing I had of her, and it seemed like betraying her memory. But she'd understand this. She always valued practical necessity over sentimental attachment. Nathaniel, no, I can't ask you to... You're not asking, I'm offering. He grabbed her shoulders, making her look at him directly. How much do you think the jewelry is worth? I don't know. I'm not a jeweler. My mother's engagement ring alone was valued at $300 15 years ago. There's also a necklace, earrings, a brooch. Together, they might bring close to what we need. Might bring. That's not certain. Nothing is certain, but it's a chance. Nathaniel released her shoulders, stepping back. I'll ride to Denver tomorrow, find a reputable jeweler. Even if we don't get the full amount, we'll get close enough to negotiate with the bank. Clara shook her head slowly. That's your family's legacy, all you have left of your mother. My mother would tell me that land and honest work matter more than jewels collecting dust in a satchel. She'd tell me that family isn't just blood, it's the people you choose to build a life with. He paused, the truth of his own words settling over him. You're my family now, Clara. You and this ranch and this hard, beautiful place. I won't let it be taken without a fight. For a long moment, Clara simply stared at him, her expression cycling through emotions too quick to identify. Then, to his shock, she stepped forward and embraced him, a brief, fierce hug that ended almost as soon as it began. Thank you, she whispered. Thomas would have liked you very much. The next morning, Nathaniel rode out before dawn with the small velvet pouch tucked securely in his saddlebag. Denver was 2 days' hard ride, but he pushed Juniper as much as he dared, stopping only when necessary. The jewelry represented his last connection to his previous life, the final thread linking him to the man he'd been. Selling it felt like severing that thread completely, and he discovered he was entirely at peace with that. Denver had grown since he'd passed through weeks ago, more buildings sprouting like mushrooms, more people flooding in chasing dreams of silver and quick fortune. The jeweler he found on Larimer Street was a sharp-eyed man who examined each piece with a loupe and careful attention. This is quality work, he admitted, studying the engagement ring. Old-fashioned settings, but the stones are excellent. Where did you acquire these? They were my mother's. I need to sell them. The jeweler looked at him with the assessing gaze of someone who'd heard every desperate story. Times are hard. Times require difficult choices. I can offer you $600 for the lot. Nathaniel's heart sank. They're worth more than that. To you, perhaps. To me, they're inventory I'll need to hold until I find the right buyer. $600 is fair considering my risk. They haggled for an hour, Nathaniel drawing on every negotiating skill he'd learned in his father's business. The jeweler was tough but honest, and they finally settled on $720. Not quite enough, but closer than Nathaniel had dared hope. He left the shop with cash heavy in his pocket and his mother's jewelry gone to strangers. For a moment, standing in the Denver street with people streaming past, he felt unmoored. The last anchor to his past finally cut loose. Then he thought of Clara waiting at the ranch, of the valley bathed in evening light, of the honest work that awaited his return. The unmoored feeling transformed into something else. Freedom, maybe, or purpose. The ride back took another 2 days, and he arrived at the ranch after dark to find Clara pacing the yard despite the late hour. She rushed to him as he dismounted, her face tight with worry. "You were gone so long, I thought—" She stopped herself, visibly gathering control. "Did you find a buyer?" $720. He pulled the cash from his pocket, pressed it into her hands. "It's not quite enough, but it's close." Clara stared at the money as if it might vanish. "This is real. You actually did this. We're partners, aren't we? Partners don't let each other fail." She looked up at him, and in the lamplight spilling from the house, he saw tears tracking down her cheeks, the first tears he'd seen from her. "I don't know how to thank you. Help me unsaddle Juniper and tell me what's happened while I was gone. That's thanks enough." They worked together in the barn, falling back into familiar rhythms, and Clara filled him in on 3 days' worth of ranch news. A calf born healthy, fence repairs completed, a potential buyer interested in purchasing some of their yearling cattle at decent prices. Normal things, everyday things, the continuing life of the ranch that would now have a chance to continue. "We'll go to town tomorrow," Clara said as they walked to the house. "Talk to the bank, see if the $720 plus what I've saved is enough to satisfy them, or at least negotiate terms. And if it's not, then we fight. We figure out another way. But at least now we're fighting with weapons instead of empty hands." The bank manager in Redemption Creek was a thin man named Morrison who wore his power like an uncomfortable suit. He listened to their proposal with the expression of someone who'd heard too many desperate pleas. $720 cash and another $60 you've saved, he repeated. That leaves you 20 short of the full debt. "We can make up the difference by the end of summer," Clara said firmly. "The yearlings will fetch good prices at market, and we've got wool coming from the fall shearing. You'll get your money." Morrison leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Mrs. Vaughn, I've extended you considerable latitude already. The bank has a responsibility to its depositors. This property could be sold to settlers who'd pay cash immediately." "This property is worked land with proven productivity," Nathaniel interjected, drawing on his business training. "Selling to settlers is a gamble. They might fail within a year, leaving you with land you can't easily resell. We're offering you guaranteed payment from an established operation. That's better than speculation on your part." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "You're the husband, I take it. The one from back east." "I'm Clara's partner in this enterprise, yes." "And you think your Eastern education gives you insight into Wyoming banking?" "I think my experience in finance gives me insight into risk assessment," Nathaniel said evenly. "You're being offered $780 now, with 20 more guaranteed within 3 months. That's better terms than you'd get from most transactions." Morrison studied them both, clearly weighing his options and his prejudices. Finally, he sighed. "Very well. I'll accept the $780 now and extend your note for the remaining 20, due by September 1st. But that's my final offer." "If you're short by even $1 come September, I'm foreclosing immediately. Are we clear?" "Perfectly clear," Clara said, her relief carefully hidden but audible to Nathaniel, who'd learned to read her moods. "We'll have your money, Mr. Morrison. You can depend on that." They completed the paperwork in tense silence, and when they finally left the bank with the revised note safely in Clara's possession, she walked straight to the church at the end of the street. Nathaniel followed, surprised, as Clara had never expressed particular religiosity. She didn't go inside. Instead, she stood in the small cemetery behind the building, stopping at a weathered wooden cross that bore Thomas Vaughn's name and dates. She knelt in the grass, touching the wood gently. "We saved it," she said softly. "The ranch. Your dream. It's safe for now, Thomas." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was stronger. "Nathaniel helped. He sold his family's jewels to save our land. You always said the mark of a good man was what he did when it cost him something. I think you'd approve of this one." Nathaniel stood back, giving her privacy for this conversation with the dead. He felt like an intruder on something sacred, but Clara had brought him here deliberately, including him in this moment of triumph and remembrance. She stood finally, wiping her eyes unselfconsciously, and turned to him. Thank you for everything, for staying, for working, for believing this place was worth saving. It is worth saving, Nathaniel said simply. And so are you. Something passed between them in that cemetery, some understanding that went deeper than words. They weren't in love. Clara had been honest about that, and Nathaniel respected it. But they were bound together now by shared struggle and mutual respect, by the knowledge that they'd stood together against the threat of loss and emerged victorious. That was its own kind of love, he realized. Not romantic, but no less powerful for that. They rode back to the ranch in the golden afternoon light, and Nathaniel felt a sense of peace he'd never experienced in his former life. The challenges weren't over. They still needed to earn that final $20, and the ranch would always demand more than they could easily give. But they'd proven they could face crises together and emerge stronger. The work that awaited them hadn't changed. Cattle still needed tending, fences still needed mending, the land still demanded constant vigilance. But now they faced it without the crushing weight of potential loss hanging over every decision. That evening, as they worked together to prepare supper, Clara seemed lighter somehow, as if a burden she'd carried for years had finally eased. She actually hummed while cooking, a tuneless but cheerful sound that made Nathaniel smile. "What?" she asked, catching his expression. "Nothing, just, it's good to hear you content." Content is ambitious. I'll settle for not terrified we're losing everything. She stirred the pot on the stove, then looked at him seriously. "What you did selling those jewels, that was beyond the call of duty, beyond what anyone could reasonably expect." "I didn't do it out of duty." "Then why?" Nathaniel considered his answer carefully, wanting to be honest without overstepping the boundaries Clara had established. "Because this is home. Because you gave me a chance when I had nothing and nowhere else to go. Because working beside you, building this life, has given me purpose I never had in Boston. I couldn't let that be taken away without fighting for it." Clara nodded slowly. "I understand that. The need to fight for something that matters." She served out their meal, the simple fare of beans and cornbread that nevertheless tasted like celebration. "To partnerships," she said, raising her coffee cup. "To partnerships," Nathaniel echoed, and they drank to survival and stubborn hope. The summer deepened, bringing heat that shimmered off the prairie and turned the grass golden. They worked from before dawn until after dark, driven by the need to earn that final $20 and secure their position. The yearling cattle went to market and fetched better prices than expected. The wool from their small sheep flock brought decent money. Slowly, painfully, they built up their reserve. But it was during this time that Nathaniel noticed something changing in Clara. She laughed more often, smiled more freely. The rigid control she'd maintained began to ease slightly, as if saving the ranch had freed her to be more than just its guardian. She would sometimes tell stories about her early years with Thomas, the disasters and triumphs of two young people carving a life from wilderness. She'd share her dreams for expanding the operation, for breeding better stock, for improvements to the buildings and land. And she began to ask Nathaniel about his past, not with the suspicion of their early days, but with genuine curiosity about the man he'd been before becoming a rancher. "What did you do for entertainment back east?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, the dogs sprawled at their feet. "Parties, mostly. Social gatherings where everyone said what they thought others wanted to hear. Theater performances, concerts, reading, when I could escape the social obligations." "Did you enjoy it?" "I thought I did, but looking back, I think I was just performing my assigned role. The dutiful son, the eligible bachelor, the promising young businessman. I don't know if I ever figured out who I actually was underneath all that performance." "And now?" Clara asked quietly. "Do you know who you are?" Nathaniel thought about his calloused hands, his sun-weathered face, his muscles developed through honest labor. He thought about the satisfaction of a job well done, the pride of saving a calf's life, the deep tiredness that came from productive work. "I'm a rancher," he said simply, "a man learning to read the land and the animals, learning to survive through skill and determination. That's more real than anything I was before." Clara studied him in the fading light. "You've earned that title. When you first arrived, I thought rancher was something you'd play at until it got too hard, but you've become it for real." The compliment warmed him more than it probably should have. I had a good teacher. You had the will to learn. That's rarer than you'd think. She stood, stretching. Come on, we should check on that heifer who's close to calving. These things always seem to happen at night. They walked to the barn together, falling into the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to work as a unit. Rarer than you'd think. She stood, stretching. Come on, we should check on that heifer who's close to calving. These things always seem to happen at night. They walked to the barn together, falling into the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to work as a unit. The heifer was indeed in early labor, and they settled in to monitor her progress. It was a long vigil, but the birth went smoothly, and by midnight they had a healthy bull calf nursing vigorously. That's $300 of future profit right there, Clara said with satisfaction, watching the calf. If we can keep him healthy through winter, he'll fetch good money as a breeding bull. Everything always comes back to money, Nathaniel observed. Money's just the measure of survival out here. Every dollar means feed we can buy, equipment we can replace, security against disaster. It's not greed, it's arithmetic. I know. I'm not criticizing. Clara leaned against the stall rail, her profile lit by lamplight. Sometimes I wonder what Thomas would make of all this. He never worried about money the way I do. He had faith that hard work would be enough, that the land would provide if we just kept at it. He sounds like an optimist. He was. I'm the pragmatist who kept us from starving during bad years. She smiled slightly. We balanced each other well. Do we balance each other? Nathaniel asked, the question emerging before he'd fully considered it. Clara was silent for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. Yes, I think we do. You bring skills I lack, the financial knowledge, the patience with details, the way you can work through problems methodically. I bring the practical experience, the understanding of the land. Together, she trailed off, then started again. Together we're stronger than either of us would be alone. That's as good a foundation as any. It was perhaps the closest she'd come to acknowledging that their partnership had evolved beyond simple convenience. Nathaniel felt a surge of something he didn't want to examine too closely. Not quite hope, but related to it. The possibility that Clara might someday see him as more than just a reliable worker, that the walls around her heart might eventually lower enough to let him close her. But he also understood that pushing would destroy whatever fragile thing was building between them. Clara needed to come to any realizations on her own timeline without pressure or expectation. So he simply nodded and said, I'm grateful to be your partner in this. They walked back to the house under stars scattered like diamond dust across black velvet, and the Wyoming night was cool and perfect. Inside, they parted for their separate rooms as always, but something had shifted again, another small step toward a future neither of them could quite see, but both were beginning to believe might be possible. The summer rolled toward August, and their reserve of cash grew slowly but steadily. They would make the final payment with money to spare, securing the ranch for another year. It should have felt like complete victory, but Nathaniel noticed Clara growing increasingly restless as the deadline approached, as if she didn't quite believe their reprieve was real. What happens after we make the payment? He asked one evening. We keep working, keep building, try to stay ahead of the next crisis. Clara stared at the ledger without really seeing it. It never stops, Nathaniel. There's always another challenge, another threat. Sometimes I wonder if Thomas had the right idea, dying young before the struggle wore him down to nothing. Clara, Nathaniel's voice was sharp enough to make her look up. You don't mean that. No, she admitted quietly. But I'm tired. I've been fighting for so long, first to build this place, then to keep it alive after Thomas died. Sometimes I wonder what I'm fighting for anymore. You're fighting because this place matters, because you matter, because what you and Thomas built deserves to continue. He reached across the table, almost touching her hand before remembering himself and pulling back. You're not alone in the fight anymore. That has to count for something. Clara's eyes glistened in the lamplight. It does. More than you know. She closed the ledger with a decisive snap. You're right. We've come too far to give in to exhaustion now. We'll make the payment, secure the ranch, and keep building. That's what Thomas would want. That's what I want. Then that's what we'll do. And they would, together, partners in survival and something more, something neither had expected but both were learning to value. The future remained uncertain, as it always was on the frontier, but for the first time since Thomas's death, Clara faced it without feeling entirely alone. That made all the difference. August arrived with heat that seemed to press down from a brass sky, and with it came the storm that would test everything they'd built together. It started, as storms often do, with something small and seemingly insignificant. Nathaniel was mending fence in the north pasture when he noticed the cattle behaving strangely. They clustered together despite the heat, bellowing with an agitation that set his nerves on edge. He rode closer, scanning for predators or injury, and that's when he saw the first sick cow. She stood apart from the herd, head lowered, flanks heaving. Foam flecked her muzzle, and when she turned her head toward him, her eyes were glazed with fever. Nathaniel's stomach clenched with instant dread. He'd seen enough ranch work now to recognize when something was seriously wrong. He rode hard back to the house, finding Clara in the barn sorting through their medical supplies. "We've got a sick cow in the north pasture. Looks bad." Clara's head snapped up, her expression shifting immediately to alert focus. "Show me." They rode out together, Nathaniel leading her to the afflicted animal. Clara dismounted before Prophet had fully stopped, approaching the cow with careful attention. She examined the animal's eyes, checked her gums, felt her temperature with a practiced hand against the cow's neck. "Damn," Clara breathed. "This is shipping fever. I've seen it before. It spreads fast through a herd if you're not careful. What do we do?" "Isolate her immediately. Check every other animal. Any that show signs get separated from the healthy stock. We'll need to dose them with everything we have and pray it's enough." Clara's jaw set in that stubborn line Nathaniel knew meant she was preparing for a fight. This could wipe out half our herd if we're not aggressive. They worked through the afternoon, identifying 3 more infected animals and moving them to a quarantine area hastily fenced off near the barn. Clara mixed treatments from her medical kit, evil-smelling concoctions that the sick cattle fought against swallowing. Nathaniel held the animals steady while Clara forced the medicine down their throats, both of them getting kicked and covered in filth for their efforts. "Keep watching the rest," Clara instructed as the sun lowered toward the mountains. "Shipping fever's sneaky. An animal can look fine at noon and be dying by sunset. We need to catch every case early." That night, they took turns keeping vigil over the sick animals and monitoring the healthy herd. Nathaniel drew the midnight to dawn shift, walking among the cattle with a lantern, looking for any sign of the telltale symptoms. The darkness pressed close, and every sound seemed magnified. The shuffle of hooves, the occasional cough that made his heart race, until he verified it was just normal cattle noise. He found another sick cow just before dawn. Her name was Bessie, one of their best breeding stock, and she was deteriorating faster than the others. Her breathing came in labored gasps, and she'd gone down in the grass, unable to rise. Nathaniel ran for Clara, finding her collapsed at the kitchen table with her head on her arms, grabbing what sleep she could between crises. She came instantly awake at his touch, asking no unnecessary questions, just following him back to Bessie with her medical kit. "She's bad," Clara said quietly, kneeling beside the cow. "Real bad. Can you save her?" "I can try." They worked over Bessie for an hour, trying every treatment Clara knew. Nathaniel held the cow's head in his lap, stroking her neck and murmuring reassurances while Clara forced medicine and tried to ease the animal's labored breathing. But despite everything, Bessie's breathing grew more ragged, more desperate. "Come on, girl," Nathaniel whispered. "You're strong. You've survived winters and wolves and everything else. Don't quit now." But Bessie was past hearing. With a final shuddering breath, she went still in Nathaniel's arms. For a moment, he simply sat there in the pre-dawn darkness, holding the dead weight of an animal he'd helped birth, and felt something crack inside his chest. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. "She was too far gone when we found her. She had a calf this spring. What happens to him? We'll bottle feed him if we have to, but first, we need to focus on saving the rest." Clara's voice was steady, but Nathaniel could see the grief in her eyes. Every lost animal was a loss of income, yes, but it was also personal, each one a creature they'd invested care and effort into keeping alive. They buried Bessie at dawn, digging the grave deep enough to prevent scavengers from reaching the body. It was exhausting work after a sleepless night, but necessary. Then they returned to checking the herd, identifying 2 more sick animals, administering treatments that might or might not work. By the 3rd day, they had 9 cattle in quarantine, and both Nathaniel and Clara were running on desperation and coffee. They moved through the work in a fog of exhaustion, checking animals, mixing medicines, providing supportive care to creatures that couldn't understand why they hurt. 2 more died despite their efforts, and each loss felt like personal failure. "This is going to bankrupt us," Clara said on the 4th night, her voice hollow as they sat on the porch after another grueling day. "Even if we save the rest, we've lost 3 already. That's $600 minimum, plus the cost of medicines, the time we're losing from other work, the stress on the remaining herd." She dropped her head into her hands. "I can't believe this is happening now, right when we'd finally gotten ahead." Nathaniel was too tired to offer platitudes. They both knew the arithmetic of survival, and the numbers were brutal. Instead, he simply sat beside her in silence, their shoulders nearly touching, sharing the burden of exhaustion and worry. "I keep thinking about Thomas," Clara said quietly. "How he used to say that ranching was just managing one crisis after another, and the winners were the ones stubborn enough to keep fighting." She laughed bitterly. "I'm starting to think he was too optimistic." "He was right, though," Nathaniel said. "We're still fighting. We haven't quit." "Not yet. But there's only so much fight in a person, Nathaniel. I'm starting to scrape the bottom of my reserves." He wanted to reach for her hand to offer some physical comfort, but he knew Clara would likely pull away. So instead he said, "Then borrow some of mine. I've got plenty. I spent years doing nothing meaningful. Think of all the fight I've got stored up from not using it." Clara looked at him, and despite her exhaustion, a smile ghosted across her face. "That's a terrible metaphor. I'm too tired to craft good ones. But the point stands. You're not fighting this alone. Whatever happens, we face it together." "Together," Claire repeated softly, as if testing the word. "I'm not used to that anymore." "Get used to it. You're stuck with me." They sat in silence as the stars emerged, and Nathaniel felt Clara's shoulder relax slightly against his. It was a small victory in a time of crisis, but he'd learned to value small victories. They were sometimes all you got. The shipping fever ran its course over the following week, claiming 2 more animals before finally releasing its grip on the herd. Of the 9 cattle that had fallen sick, 5 survived, better odds than Clara had predicted, but still a devastating loss. 4 cattle represented not just immediate financial hardship, but also future breeding capacity, lost, genetic potential eliminated, years of careful herd management set back. They stood together in the pasture after releasing the recovered cattle back to the main herd, watching them rejoin their companions with evident relief. The sick animals had lost considerable weight and would need months to recover their condition, but they'd lived. That had to count for something. 5 out of 9, Clara said quietly. Could be worse. Could be better. Always could be, she sighed, the sound carrying bone-deep weariness. We'll need to adjust our budget, cut back on improvements we'd planned, maybe sell some sheep to offset the cattle losses. We'll figure it out, Nathaniel said with more confidence than he felt. We've gotten through worse. Have we, though? This on top of the mortgage, the constant repair needs, the market prices. Clara trailed off, then shook her head as if to clear it. Sorry, I'm just tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of barely staying ahead of disaster. Then rest. I can handle the work for a day or 2. Clara laughed without humor. Rest. That's a luxury I can't afford. Clara. Nathaniel turned to face her fully. You're no good to this ranch if you collapse from exhaustion. Take tomorrow. Sleep late. Do light work. Let me carry the heavy load for once. You don't know enough. I know more than you think. You've taught me well. Trust me to handle one day without supervision. She studied him with those winter sky eyes, and he could see the internal debate playing across her features. Finally, she nodded. All right. One day. But if anything seems wrong, I'll come get you immediately. I promise. That night, Clara actually went to bed at a reasonable hour instead of staying up doing paperwork or planning the next day's work. Nathaniel lay in his own bed listening to the unfamiliar silence from her room and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a physical thing. Tomorrow, the ranch would be entirely his to manage. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. He woke before dawn as usual, moving quietly so as not to disturb Clara, and set about the morning routine. Coffee first, strong enough to function as medicine. Then outside to check the stock, ensuring no animals had developed problems overnight. The morning was cool and beautiful, the sky gradually lightening from black to deep blue to rose gold, and Nathaniel felt a surge of something that might have been confidence. He could do this. He'd learned enough, worked hard enough, earned his place here. One day of running the ranch alone wasn't beyond his capabilities. The morning chores went smoothly, feeding horses, checking cattle, moving the sheep to fresh pasture. By the time the sun had fully risen, Nathaniel had worked through half his mental checklist and was feeling almost optimistic. Maybe Clara's constant vigilance wasn't entirely necessary. Maybe things could run smoothly without her iron control. That's when he found the break in the south fence. It was a bad one, an entire section down, probably damaged by the sick cattle pushing against it during their quarantine and finally failing under the strain. Worse, several head of cattle had escaped through the gap and were nowhere to be seen. Nathaniel's stomach dropped as he realized the implications. Cattle loose on open range could wander for miles, get mixed up with other herds, be claimed by unscrupulous neighbors, or simply disappear into the wilderness. He rode back to the ranch at a gallop, his mind racing through options. Wake Clara and admit he'd lost control within hours of taking charge? Try to handle it himself and risk making things worse? The choice seemed obvious. This was beyond his ability to fix alone. He found Clara already up and dressed, standing in the kitchen with a coffee cup and a frown. "I heard you riding hard. What's wrong?" "South fence is down. At least 6 cattle loose, maybe more. I'm sorry. I should have checked it first thing. Should have noticed it was weakening." "Stop." Clara set down her cup with careful control. "Did you find the break?" "Yes, it's bad. Whole section needs replacing." "Then we fix it. Grab tools and extra fencing. We'll repair it first, then track the missing cattle." She was already moving, pulling on her boots and work gloves. "This isn't your fault, Nathaniel. Fences break. It happens." "But I was supposed to manage things, give you rest, and you handled it correctly. You found the problem and came for help. That's exactly what you should have done." She grabbed her rifle from beside the door. "Now come on. The longer those cattle are loose, the harder they'll be to find." They rode out together, and Nathaniel felt his panic easing slightly in the face of Clara's calm competence. She assessed the fence damage with a practiced eye, already planning the repair in her head. "This'll take most of the day to fix properly," she said, "but we can't leave it. More cattle will escape. You start on the repair while I track the missing animals." "You're going alone?" "I've been tracking cattle since before you knew what a cow looked like. I'll be fine." She saw his expression and her voice softened. "This is what ranching is, Nathaniel. Constant problems requiring constant solutions. You didn't fail. You just encountered something new." She rode off before he could argue, and Nathaniel turned to the fence with a mixture of frustration and determination. The repair required pulling out damaged posts, resetting new ones, stringing wire with precise tension. It was hard, physical labor that left no room for dwelling on his inadequacy. He worked through the morning and by noon had made significant progress. The physical exertion helped burn off his anxious energy, and he found himself falling into the focused state that good work could bring, where thought narrowed to the immediate task and everything else faded away. Clara returned mid-afternoon, driving 5 of the missing cattle ahead of her. She looked exhausted but satisfied. Found them in the next valley over, heading toward the Pritchard Ranch. Another hour and we'd have lost them for good. "That's 5. We're missing at least 1 more." "I know. Couldn't find any sign of it. Either it went further than I could track, or—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Or it had been taken by a predator, or fallen into a ravine, or met any number of bad ends that the territory offered." "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said. "If I'd checked the fence earlier—" "Stop apologizing for things you can't control." Clara dismounted stiffly, clearly feeling the day's hard ride. "You've made good progress on the repair. Help me secure these 5 and we'll finish the fence before dark." They worked together through the afternoon, their coordination smooth despite the crisis. The fence got repaired, the recovered cattle returned to the herd, the missing animal noted as a loss they'd have to absorb. By the time they finished, the sun was setting in spectacular colors that neither of them had energy to appreciate. So much for your day of rest, Nathaniel said as they rode back to the house. I got an extra hour of sleep. That's practically a vacation. Clara's attempt at levity fell flat, exhaustion making her voice heavy. We can't keep doing this, Nathaniel. Doing what? Barely staying ahead of disaster. Every time we get some breathing room, something else happens. The mortgage, the shipping fever, now this. It's like the land itself is fighting us. The land doesn't care either way. It just exists. We're the ones deciding to fight for it. Maybe we should stop deciding that. The words came out quietly, almost casual, but Nathaniel heard the despair underneath. Maybe we should take Morrison's standing offer to buy the ranch, cut our losses, start over somewhere easier. Nathaniel pulled Juniper to a halt, forcing Clara to stop as well. You don't mean that, don't I? I'm tired, Nathaniel. Tired of fighting, tired of losing, tired of watching everything Thomas and I built slowly crumble, no matter how hard I worked to hold it together. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Maybe I'm just not strong enough to do this without him. That's exhaustion talking, not reason. Is it? Or is it finally accepting reality? I've been telling myself for 3 years that I could keep this place running alone. Then you came, and I thought having help would make the difference. But problems keep coming, and we keep barely surviving, and I don't know how much longer I can keep telling myself it's going to get better. Nathaniel felt something tighten in his chest. Fear mixed with frustration, mixed with fierce protectiveness of this woman who'd given him purpose and place. Clara, look at me. She did finally, and he saw the vulnerability in her face, the cracks in the armor she usually maintained so carefully. You're right that we're barely staying ahead, he said. You're right that it's hard, probably harder than anything either of us imagined. But you're wrong about not being strong enough. You've survived 3 years of this after losing your husband. You've kept this ranch alive through disasters that would have broken most people. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen. Surviving isn't the same as thriving. No, but it's the necessary first step. And we're past just surviving now, Clara. We're actually building something. The mortgage is handled, the shipping fever is past, and yes, we lost a cow today, but we saved 5. Those are victories, even if they don't feel like it right now. Clara's eyes glistened in the fading light. What if it's not enough? What if I'm not enough? You're enough, Nathaniel said with absolute certainty. You're more than enough. And with both of us working together, we're stronger than any single crisis. He paused, then added more softly, Don't give up now, Clara. Not when we've come so far. She studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Then she nodded slowly. All right. I'm just tired. Tomorrow will look better. Tomorrow will look exactly like today, which is to say, difficult but manageable. And we'll manage it together, same as we managed today. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, less heavy with despair, more thoughtful. When they reached the barn, Clara dismounted and stood for a moment with her hand on Prophet's neck. Thank you, she said quietly, for not letting me quit. I'm not letting you quit because I need you, Nathaniel said honestly. This ranch needs you. I'm learning, but you're still the heart of this operation. Without you, none of this works. That's not true anymore. You could run this place without me now. Maybe technically, but I don't want to. We're partners, remember? Partners don't abandon each other when things get hard. Clara looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When did you become so wise about ranching? I had a good teacher who also happens to be impossibly stubborn. It rubs off. She laughed, a genuine sound that eased the tension between them. Come on, let's get these horses settled and find some food. Everything's better after you eat. They worked through the evening routine with their usual coordination and over a simple supper of reheated stew. They began planning the next steps, adjusting their budget to account for losses, identifying repairs that could be delayed, calculating how much they needed to earn from the fall cattle sale to get through winter comfortably. We'll make it, Claire said, studying the numbers. It'll be tight, but we'll make it. We always do. She looked up at him, and something in her gaze made Nathaniel's breath catch. I don't tell you often enough how much I appreciate what you've done here, how you've transformed from someone who barely knew which end of a cow to milk to someone I can trust with any part of this operation. That matters, Nathaniel. You matter. The words hit him harder than expected, emotion rising in his throat. This place gave me a life worth living. You gave me that. I'm the one who should be grateful. Then we're both grateful. That's a good foundation. They finished the planning and cleaned up from supper, moving through the small house with easy familiarity. When they parted for their separate rooms, Clara paused at her doorway. Nathaniel? Yes? I'm glad you stayed. Glad you didn't run when things got hard. There were moments I thought you would, but you never did. That means more than you know. Before he could respond, she disappeared into her room, leaving him standing in the hallway with a heart that felt suddenly too large for his chest. He went to his own room and lay in the darkness, thinking about Clara's words, about the life they were building together through crisis and determination. Somewhere in the hard months since his arrival, this arrangement had stopped being purely practical. They'd become something more than business partners, something deeper than friends. What that something was, Nathaniel couldn't quite define, but he felt it growing between them like grass pushing through spring earth, stubborn, persistent, alive. The next days settled into a new rhythm. They worked with renewed focus, as if their conversation had cleared some blockage and allowed energy to flow more freely. Nathaniel noticed Clara smiling more often, even laughing at the small disasters that would have sent her into tight-lipped silence weeks ago. When a sheep escaped its pen and led them on an hour-long chase, she actually found it funny rather than frustrating. That damn animal has more personality than most people I know, she said, catching her breath after they'd finally cornered the escapee. I'm almost impressed by its determination. Should we name it Houdini? We should name it Stu, since that's what it's going to be if it tries that again. But she was smiling, and the sheep was safely returned to its pen unharmed. These moments of lightness were new, and Nathaniel treasured them. The work remained as hard as ever, but the weight of it felt somehow lighter when shared with laughter. He found himself looking forward to evenings on the porch, where they'd sit together after supper and talk about everything and nothing. Ranch business mixing with stories from their pasts, plans for the future interwoven with comfortable silence. One evening in late August, as they sat watching the sun set in impossible colors, Clara said something that made Nathaniel's world shift. I've been thinking, she began slowly, as if choosing her words with great care. When you first arrived, I told you I couldn't offer love. The Thomas had taken that with him when he died. Nathaniel's heart began beating faster, but he kept his voice steady. I remember. I need you to know that was true at the time. I wasn't lying or trying to protect myself. I genuinely believed my capacity for romantic love had died with Thomas. She paused, staring out at the valley that had been her whole world for so long. But something's changed. I'm not sure when it started or how, but somewhere along the way you stopped being just a hired hand or even a business partner. You became... She trailed off, seeming to struggle with how to finish. What did I become? Nathaniel asked quietly, almost afraid to breathe. Clara turned to look at him directly, and in the golden light her eyes were soft in a way he'd rarely seen. Someone I trust completely. Someone whose opinion matters. Someone I look forward to seeing every morning and miss when you're gone even for a few hours. Someone who makes me laugh when I'd forgotten how. Someone who... She took a breath. Someone I think I might be falling in love with, if I haven't already. The words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten with emotion too strong for easy expression. Clara, I know this complicates things, she continued, speaking faster now, as if afraid to lose momentum. I know you probably didn't sign up for actual feelings beyond partnership and mutual respect, and I'm not asking you to reciprocate or change anything about our arrangement. I just needed to be honest with you because you've always been honest with me, and you deserve the same in return. Clara, stop! Nathaniel reached for her hand the first time he'd initiated such contact. Her fingers were work-roughened and strong, and they trembled slightly in his grasp. You think I haven't been falling in love with you since practically the moment I arrived? She stared at him. But you never said anything. Because you told me your heart was buried with Thomas. Because I respected your boundaries and didn't want to make you uncomfortable. Because I was terrified that if you knew how I felt, you'd send me away rather than deal with complications you hadn't asked for. I wouldn't have sent you away. I couldn't risk it. This place, this life, you, it all became too precious to risk losing through presumption. He squeezed her hand gently. But since we're being honest, yes. I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you laugh when sheep escape. I love how you care for every animal on this ranch like their family. I love your competence and your vulnerability and the way you never give up no matter how hard things get. I've been in love with you for months, Clara Vaughn, and I was fully prepared to never tell you if it meant I could stay and work beside you. Tears were tracking down Clara's face now, catching the sunset light. You love me. Desperately. Even though I'm difficult and demanding and barely know how to be soft? Especially because of those things, you're real, Clara. You're honest. You're the strongest person I've ever known. Why wouldn't I love you? She laughed wetly. I can think of about 100 reasons. Then you're not thinking clearly. Clara studied him for a long moment, and then, moving with the same determination she brought to every difficult task, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was tentative at first, questioning, as if she'd forgotten how such things worked. But when Nathaniel responded, when his free hand came up to cup her cheek gently, the kiss deepened into something more certain. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing unsteadily, Clara rested her forehead against his. I'm terrified, she whispered. Of what? Of losing you the way I lost Thomas. Of opening my heart and having it destroyed again. Of being happy and then having happiness ripped away. Her voice broke. I don't know if I'm strong enough to survive that twice. Nathaniel pulled back enough to look into her eyes. I can't promise I'll never die or that disaster won't strike. Life doesn't offer those guarantees, but I can promise I'll fight with everything I have to stay alive and build a future with you. I can promise that every day I have, I'll spend loving you and working beside you and being grateful for the chance. That's all anyone can really promise, Clara. But I mean it with every fiber of my being. She kissed him again, less tentative now, more sure. And when they finally drew apart this time, she was smiling through her tears. All right then, we'll risk it. Together. Together, Nathaniel echoed. And the word had never meant so much. They sat there on the porch as darkness fell and stars emerged, holding hands and occasionally stealing kisses like teenagers discovering romance for the first time. It felt both momentous and utterly natural, as if this moment had been inevitable from the instant Nathaniel stepped off that train months ago. What happens now? Clara asked eventually. Nothing changes except everything, Nathaniel said. We keep working the ranch, keep building our life. But now we're doing it as partners in every sense, not just the practical ones. We're already married legally. Does this mean we're married for real now? I think we've been married for real for a while. We were just too stubborn to admit it. He brushed a strand of hair from her face tenderly. But if you want some kind of acknowledgement, some moment that marks the change, I'm happy to provide it. Clara considered this. Thomas and I got married in a church with a preacher and witnesses and all the proper ceremony. It was lovely, and I'll always treasure that memory. But with you, she looked around at the ranch, the land stretching into darkness, the stars overhead. With you, I think this is ceremony enough. The land as our witness, the work as our vows, the life we've built as our celebration. That's perfect, Nathaniel said honestly. They sat in silence for a while longer, simply existing together in their new reality. Eventually, Clara stood and held out her hand. Come to bed with me. It wasn't a question or a demand, just a simple invitation offered with the same directness she brought to everything. Nathaniel took her hand and let her lead him inside, to her room instead of his, to the bed she'd shared with Thomas and slept in alone for 3 years. Are you sure? He asked as they stood beside the bed. I'm sure. Are you? I've never been more sure of anything. What happened between them that night was tender and hesitant and occasionally awkward as two people learned each other for the first time. But it was also honest and real and full of the same determination they brought to every challenge. They were building something new on the foundation of loss and hard work, and if the structure wasn't perfect yet, it was sturdy and true. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Clara's head on his chest and his arm around her shoulders, Nathaniel felt a peace he'd never experienced. This was home, this woman, this land, this life they were creating together through sheer stubborn will. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. "I love you," Clara murmured sleepily. "I love you too. Don't die on me, Nathaniel Reed." "I'll do my absolute best not to." "Good. Because I plan on keeping you around for a very long time. That's the best threat I've ever received." She laughed softly and kissed his chest, and within minutes her breathing deepened into sleep. Nathaniel lay awake a while longer, watching the moonlight paint silver patterns across the ceiling and thinking about the strange path that had brought him here. From disgrace and loss to this moment of profound rightness, from a man running from shame to one running toward purpose. The ranch would still demand everything they had tomorrow. There would still be crises and setbacks and moments of doubt, but they'd face it all together now, not just as partners in work, but as partners in every sense. That made all the difference. As sleep finally claimed him, Nathaniel's last conscious thought was gratitude, for Clara's courage in risking her heart again, for the land that had tested and transformed him, for the second chance he'd never thought he'd receive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for tonight, wrapped in love and moonlight, everything was exactly as it should be. Morning arrived with the soft insistence of early autumn light, and Nathaniel woke to find Clara already stirring beside him. She turned to face him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, taking in the reality of their new situation. Then Clara smiled, a slow, genuine expression that transformed her entire face, and Nathaniel felt his heart swell impossibly larger. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning." He reached out to trace the line of her jaw with gentle fingers. "No regrets?" "Only that we wasted so many months being stubborn." She caught his hand and kissed his palm. "But we're ranchers. Stubborn is our default setting." They rose and dressed together, the intimacy of the simple act both strange and natural. There was work waiting, as there always was, but somehow the weight of it felt lighter, shared between two people who loved each other rather than two people merely surviving together. Over coffee, Clara laid out the day's priorities with her usual efficiency, but now she punctuated her planning with occasional touches. A hand on Nathaniel's shoulder as she passed, fingers brushing his when she handed him his cup. Small gestures that spoke of affection, finding its expression in a woman who'd forgotten how to be demonstrative. "We need to start preparing for winter," she said, consulting the mental list she always seemed to carry. "Check the hay stores, repair the barn roof before the snow comes. Make sure we've got enough feed laid by. Winter in Wyoming isn't forgiving of poor preparation." "I remember you mentioning that when I first arrived. Something about it separating the survivors from the corpses." Clara laughed. "I was trying to scare you off. Clearly it didn't work." "I'm not easily scared anymore. You've trained that out of me through exposure to actual danger." "Good. You'll need that stubbornness for what's coming." She set down her cup and looked at him seriously. "Winter here is brutal, Nathaniel. We'll be snowed in for weeks at a time. The temperature drops so low that water freezes solid within minutes. Cattle can die overnight if they're not properly sheltered. It's a siege, essentially, and we're the defending force. Then we'd better prepare properly." They spent the following weeks in focused preparation, working from dawn until long after dark to ensure everything was ready for winter's assault. The barn roof got patched with new shingles, a project that had Nathaniel balanced on rickety ladders, while Clara handed up materials and offered unhelpful commentary about his fear of heights. The hayloft was filled to capacity with feed they'd cut and dried over the summer. Equipment was serviced and stored, vulnerable buildings reinforced against wind and snow. One afternoon, while they were working together to split firewood for the long winter ahead, a rider approached from the direction of town. It was Morrison from the bank, and Nathaniel felt Clara tense beside him at the sight. "Mrs. Vaughn," Morrison called as he dismounted. Then, with slightly less certainty, "Mr. Reed?" "Mr. Morrison," Clara said coolly, setting down her axe. "What brings you out here?" Morrison removed his hat, worrying the brim between his hands in a gesture that suggested discomfort. "I wanted to inform you in person rather than through official channels. The bank has reviewed your account, and in light of your successful payment of the mortgage and your demonstrated commitment to the property, we're prepared to offer you a line of credit for expansion." Clara's eyebrows rose in surprise. "A line of credit?" "Yes. We believe the Vaughn Ranch has proven itself a sound investment. If you're interested in purchasing additional stock or making improvements, the bank would be willing to extend reasonable terms. Morrison glanced at Nathaniel. Your husband's financial management has been noted. The ledgers you've submitted show a level of planning we rarely see from ranch operations. I'll consider it, Clara said carefully, and Nathaniel could hear her instinctive wariness of debt. Thank you for the offer. After Morrison left, Clara turned to Nathaniel with an expression mixing suspicion and wonder. Did you plan that? The detailed ledgers, the financial projections? I just kept good records. That's basic business practice. Maybe in Boston. Out here, most ranchers operate on instinct and prayer. She shook her head slowly. You've changed how the bank sees us. That's not a small thing. We changed how they see us. Your successful management for 3 years after Thomas died proved the ranch was viable. I just provided documentation. Clara stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. The gesture was still new enough to surprise him, and he savored the easy affection she was learning to show. We're a good team, she said quietly. The best. They stood there in the afternoon sun, holding each other amid stacks of firewood and the distant sounds of cattle, and Nathaniel thought about how far they'd both come. From two broken people making a practical arrangement to this moment of genuine partnership and love. As September gave way to October, the land began its transformation toward winter. The grass turned from green to gold to brown. Aspens in the mountains blazed yellow against the evergreens before dropping their leaves in surrender. The cattle grew thick winter coats, and the sheep clustered together against the increasing cold. Every morning brought frost that took longer to melt, and the wind carried a sharper edge. They worked with increasing urgency, driven by the knowledge that winter would arrive suddenly and completely, giving no quarter to those unprepared. Nathaniel had learned enough to recognize the signs Clara watched for: the behavior of animals, the particular quality of light, the smell of snow in the air days before it fell. Storm coming, Clara announced one evening in late October, scanning the northern sky with practiced eyes. Big one by the look of those clouds. We need to bring the cattle down to the near pastures tonight. They rode out in the gathering dusk, the dogs ranging ahead with purposeful energy. The cattle were scattered across the upper valley, grazing on the last good grass before winter locked the land in ice. Moving them in failing light was challenging work, but they'd done it often enough now that their coordination was seamless. Clara worked one flank while Nathaniel took the other, and the dogs filled the gaps, their intelligence and training making them worth a dozen human workers. By the time they had the herd secured in pastures close to the barn, the first snowflakes were falling, large, wet flakes that caught the last light and seemed to glow. The wind was rising, and Nathaniel could feel the temperature dropping rapidly. This was the storm Clara had predicted, arriving right on schedule. They secured the horses and dogs and made it to the house just as the snow began falling in earnest. Clara immediately started building up the fire while Nathaniel checked windows and doors, ensuring they were sealed against the coming assault. By full dark, the storm was howling around the house with a fury that made their spring storm seem gentle by comparison. This is a real Wyoming blizzard, Clara said, standing at the window and watching the white chaos outside. We could be stuck inside for days. Hope you're prepared for close quarters. I think I can tolerate your company for a few days, Nathaniel said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. She leaned back against him, relaxed in a way that still sometimes surprised him. The guarded, cautious woman he'd first met had softened, allowing vulnerability and affection to show through the armor she'd worn for so long. I never thought I'd be here again, she said quietly. Happy with someone. Looking forward to being snowed in rather than dreading the isolation. Thomas would want you to be happy. I know, I used to talk to him sometimes after he died. Tell him about my day, ask his advice on decisions. I worried he'd be angry when you arrived, when I married someone else. She paused, watching the snow. But I think he'd approve. He always said life was for the living, that mourning should honor the dead but not trap the survivors. You've helped me understand what he meant. Nathaniel tightened his arms around her, moved by her honesty. Thank you for taking a chance on me. On us. Thank you for being worth the chance. The storm raged for 3 days, pinning them inside with only brief ventures to the barn to care for animals. The house felt smaller but also more intimate, a warm cocoon against the violence outside. They cooked together, read aloud from Clara's small library, played endless games of cards. They made love in the afternoon while snow piled against the windows, and talked late into the night about dreams and plans and the future they were building. On the third day, Nathaniel found Clara standing at the window, staring out at the white landscape with an expression he couldn't read. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Thomas and I tried for years to have children," she said quietly. "It never happened. The doctor in town said maybe it was me, maybe him, maybe just bad luck. After he died, I thought that door was closed forever." She glanced at him, vulnerability clear in her eyes. "But now I'm wondering if maybe it could still happen, if you'd even want that." Nathaniel's heart stuttered at the implication. Children, a family beyond just the two of them. The idea was both terrifying and deeply appealing. "I'd want that," he said carefully. "If it happens, I'd welcome it. But if it doesn't, Clara, that's all right too. You're enough. This life is enough. You say that now, but men want heirs, want their name carried forward. I'm not most men. I've learned out here that legacy isn't just about blood and names. It's about what you build, what you leave behind in the land and the work. If we have children, wonderful. If we don't, we're still building something that matters." Clara turned to face him fully, taking his hands in hers. "I love you for saying that, and I love that you mean it." "I do mean it, every word." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and when she pulled back there were tears in her eyes. "I'm so glad you answered that advertisement. So glad you stayed. Best decision I ever made." The storm finally broke on the fourth day, and they emerged into a world transformed. Snow lay thick across everything, pristine and beautiful and deceptively peaceful. They spent hours digging out pathways to the barn and checking on animals. 2 sheep had died despite their preparations, huddled together in the far corner of their shelter. They buried them in snow that was too frozen to dig through properly, marking the spot for spring burial. "This is why we prepare," Clara said, looking at the dead animals with professional sadness. "Winter takes its toll no matter how careful you are. The goal is to minimize the losses, not eliminate them. 2 out of 50. That's a good survival rate." "It is, but it still hurts." They stood together in the bright cold, and Nathaniel understood something he hadn't quite grasped before. Every loss mattered out here. Every death was personal, even when it was expected. The animals weren't just inventory or income. They were creatures Clara had cared for, invested time and effort in keeping alive. Their deaths represented both financial loss and emotional toll. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's check the cattle and get back inside. You're shivering." The cattle had weathered the storm well, clustered together for warmth in the shelter of the near pastures. They looked up at Clara and Nathaniel's approach with the placid indifference of creatures whose basic needs had been met. Feed remained in the troughs, water was available, and shelter had kept them from the worst of the wind. It was enough. As they walked back to the house, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, turning the snow-covered valley into something magical. Light refracted off every surface, creating diamonds in the air, and the mountains stood sharp and clear against an impossibly blue sky. "It's beautiful," Nathaniel said. "It is. And it'll kill you without hesitation if you're not careful." Clara squeezed his hand. "That's Wyoming. Beautiful and deadly in equal measure. You have to respect both aspects." "I've learned that. You're an excellent teacher. And you're an excellent student. Better than I expected, honestly." They spent the rest of the day working together, re-establishing routines disrupted by the storm. And that evening, as they sat by the fire with coffee and companionable silence, Clara made an announcement that shifted their world again. "I've been thinking about Morrison's offer," she said, "the line of credit. And I think we should use it, not for expansion, we're stretched thin enough already, but for improvements. Better equipment, stronger fencing, maybe a windmill for more reliable water access." She looked at him seriously. "What do you think?" Nathaniel considered carefully. "I think any debt is risk, but strategic investment in infrastructure could increase productivity and reduce labor." If we're careful about how much we borrow and maintain strict repayment discipline, it could work. That's what I thought. But I wanted your input. This is your ranch too now, Nathaniel. Decisions should be joint. The acknowledgement meant everything. Clara was truly seeing him as an equal partner, not just an employee or even a beloved helper. Then let's draw up a plan. Identify exactly what we need, cost it out, and figure out the maximum we're comfortable borrowing. We present that to Morrison rather than letting him set the terms. Clara smiled. See? This is why I love you. You think like a businessman even while covered in horse manure. It's a skill. They spent several evenings planning their proposal, debating every item, calculating return on investment and risk factors. The work was familiar to Nathaniel from his previous life, but now it had real meaning. These weren't abstract financial projections. They were decisions that would directly impact their survival and success. When they finally rode into Redemption Creek to meet with Morrison, they carried a detailed proposal that impressed even the banker's skeptical eye. After an hour of negotiation, they secured a line of credit on favorable terms, enough to fund the improvements they'd identified without overextending their resources. You two are an impressive team, Morrison admitted as they concluded the paperwork. Mrs. Vaughn, I doubted your choice when Mr. Reed first arrived. I'm man enough to admit I was wrong. I appreciate that, Clara said coolly, still not entirely forgiving the banker's earlier skepticism. On the ride home, Clara was unusually quiet. Finally, she said, I've been thinking about what Morrison called us. A team. We are a team. We're more than that. We're partners, lovers, friends, but the foundation of everything is the work we do together. The ranch. She glanced at him. I want to make it official. Change the name to the Reed Vaughn Ranch, or Vaughn Reed if you prefer. Either way, both our names on the deed, both of us recognized as equal owners. Nathaniel's throat tightened with emotion. Clara, you don't have to. I want to. This is as much yours as mine now. You've earned it through work and dedication and love. Thomas would understand. Hell, he'd probably insist on it. Then I'm honored, truly honored. Good. We'll file the papers next time we're in town. Make it legal and proper. She smiled at him. The Vaughn Reed Ranch has a nice sound to it. It does. Winter settled in fully after that first storm, bringing cold that made metal burn to touch and breath freeze in the air. They worked shortened days, spending more time inside preparing for spring, planning the next year's operations, and simply being together. Nathaniel learned the rhythms of winter ranching, the constant vigilance required to keep animals alive, the endless battle against cold and snow, the small victories of each day survived. But he also learned the beauty of it, the way morning light painted the snow in shades of rose and gold, the absolute silence after a fresh snowfall when the world seemed to hold its breath, the comfort of coming inside to warmth and Clara's smile after hours in brutal cold. Winter had its own magic if you knew how to see it. One evening in January, as they sat by the fire working on separate projects, Nathaniel updating the ledgers while Clara mended harness, she suddenly set down her work and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? He asked. I'm late. It took him a moment to understand her meaning, and then his heart began racing. Late as in I should have had my monthly courses 2 weeks ago, as in I think I might be pregnant. She said it calmly, but he could see the fear and hope warring in her eyes. Nathaniel set aside the ledgers carefully, his hands suddenly unsteady. Are you sure? Not completely. It's too early to be certain, but I know my body, Nathaniel. Something's different. She paused. I'm terrified. Of being pregnant? Of losing another person I love. If this is real, if there's a baby, that's one more heart I'm vulnerable to losing. And given my history... She didn't finish the sentence. Nathaniel crossed to her and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But we'll face this together, whatever happens. If you're pregnant, we'll prepare as best we can and hope for the best. If you're not, that's all right too. We have time. I'm 34 years old, Nathaniel. Time isn't something I have in abundance. Then we hope, and we trust, and we don't borrow tomorrow's troubles today. Clara pulled him close, burying her face against his shoulder. When did you become so wise? I learned from a very stubborn rancher who taught me that the only way to survive is to keep working and trust that things will work out. She laughed wetly. I'm not sure I actually believe that philosophy. Fake it until you do. By February, Claire's pregnancy was confirmed by the doctor in town, who examined her with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd delivered dozens of babies in the territory. He pronounced her healthy and gave them basic instructions about what to expect, most of which Clara already knew from years of helping livestock give birth. It's not exactly the same, the doctor said dryly when Clara made this comparison, but the general principle applies. Your body knows what to do. Trust it. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing the reality that had just become undeniable. There would be a baby in late summer. A child. An entirely new person joining their hard-won life. Are you all right? Nathaniel asked finally. I don't know yet. Ask me after the baby's born alive and healthy. Clara's hands rested protectively on her still flat stomach. I want this, Nathaniel, but I'm also terrified in ways I can't quite articulate. That's normal, I think. You're allowed to be terrified too. You don't have to be strong all the time. I'm not terrified, Nathaniel said honestly. I'm awed, maybe. Grateful. Hopeful. But not terrified. Why not? Because we'll figure it out the same way we figured out everything else. Together, through trial and error, and stubborn determination. He smiled at her. If we can survive Wyoming winters and shipping fever and broken fences, we can probably manage one small human. Clara laughed despite herself. That's either very wise or incredibly naive. Probably both. The news transformed the ranch in subtle ways. Clara became even more careful about safety, not taking risks she would have considered routine before. Nathaniel found himself planning for the future in concrete terms, preparing a room for the baby, calculating expenses for additional supplies, thinking about the kind of life they wanted to build for their child. The abstract future became suddenly tangible and real. Spring arrived with its usual dramatic flourish, snow melting to reveal the land beneath, grass greening almost overnight, and the cattle spreading out across the valley to graze on fresh forage. The work intensified with calving season, but this year Nathaniel handled more of the difficult births himself while Clara supervised, her growing pregnancy making the physical labor more challenging. I feel useless, she complained one evening after Nathaniel had successfully delivered twins without her assistance. You're growing an entire human. That's the opposite of useless. I'd rather be working. You are working. You're just working on different things. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful of her expanding belly. Let me carry more of the load right now. You carried it alone for 3 years before I arrived. It's my turn. Clara leaned back against him with a sigh. I'm not good at letting other people take care of things. I've noticed, but try anyway. For the baby, if not for yourself. She twisted to look at him. You're going to be a good father. I hope so. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I suspect that's universal. Thomas would have been a good father too. He'd have been patient and kind and taught our children to love the land the way he did. She paused. I wish they could have known each other. Thomas and this baby. I think they'd have liked each other. I wish that too, but the baby will know about Thomas through your stories, through the ranch he helped build. That's its own kind of legacy. You're very generous about him. Some men would resent a wife who still loves her dead husband. I'm not some men, and I don't resent Thomas. I'm grateful to him. He helped make you who you are. He built the foundation I'm building on. That deserves respect, not resentment. Clara turned in his arms to kiss him properly. I love you, Nathaniel Reed. Have I mentioned that lately? Not in at least 6 hours. I was starting to worry. She laughed and kissed him again, and they stood together in the spring evening, watching their land come alive with new growth. Everything was changing, and yet everything essential remained the same. The work, the land, the love they'd built through determination and honesty. Those foundations would hold whatever the future brought. Summer arrived with heat and hard work, and Clara's belly growing impossibly round. She moved more slowly now, but she still insisted on doing her share of the work until Nathaniel practically forced her to rest. They'd prepared the small bedroom as a nursery, with a cradle Nathaniel had built from wood salvaged from broken equipment and a rocking chair they'd purchased in town. I can't believe there's an actual person in there, Clara said one evening, her hand on her belly as the baby kicked visibly. It still seems impossible. Let me feel. She guided his hand to where the baby was moving, and Nathaniel felt the firm push of tiny feet or fists against his palm. The reality of it hit him with surprising force. This was his child, his and Clara's, a new life they'd created together. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the joy. Hello in there, he said softly to Clara's belly. We're looking forward to meeting you. The baby kicked harder, as if in response, and they both laughed. I think that's approval, Clara said. Or complaint. Hard to tell with babies, I suspect. The baby arrived on an August evening during a spectacular sunset that painted the entire valley in shades of rose and gold. Clara's labor was long and difficult, testing every ounce of her considerable strength. Nathaniel stayed with her throughout, holding her hand and offering what comfort he could while the doctor worked efficiently. Come on, Mrs. Reed, the doctor encouraged, as Clara pushed with determination that had carried her through every other challenge. Almost there. With a final effort that seemed to pull from some deep reserve of will, Clara brought their daughter into the world. The baby's first cry was strong and indignant, and the doctor's smile was the first relaxation Nathaniel had seen in his stern face. A girl, he announced, placing the cleaned and wrapped infant in Clara's arms. Small but healthy, lungs like a cattle auctioneer. Clara stared at her daughter with an expression of wonder mixed with exhaustion. The baby had dark hair and eyes that would probably lighten with time, and she was the most beautiful thing Nathaniel had ever seen besides her mother. Hello, little one, Clara whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with her finger. Welcome to the ranch. The baby's fingers closed around Clara's with surprising strength, and Nathaniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. This tiny person was theirs to protect and raise and teach. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but so was the love already flooding his heart. What should we name her? He asked. Clara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. I was thinking hope, because that's what she represents. Hope for the future. Hope that good things can come after loss. Hope that love can be found again even after you think you've lost it forever. Hope, Nathaniel repeated, testing the name. Hope Reed Vaughn. Perfect. The doctor left detailed instructions and departed, leaving them alone with their daughter as the last light faded from the sky. They sat together in the bedroom, taking turns holding Hope, marveling at her tiny features and the miracle of her existence. I can't believe we made this, Clara said, watching Hope sleep in Nathaniel's arms. This perfect little person. We did. Together. Together, Clara echoed, and the word held all the weight of their journey, from strangers making a practical arrangement to partners building a life to a family facing the future united. The following months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant work, balancing the demands of a newborn with the unending requirements of ranch life. But they managed as they'd managed every other challenge through teamwork and determination. Nathaniel learned to change diapers with the same focused attention he'd once brought to financial projections. Clara learned to nurse while simultaneously directing ranch operations, her efficiency somehow increasing rather than decreasing with the addition of a baby. Hope thrived, growing stronger and more alert each day. By her first winter, she was a bright-eyed infant who seemed fascinated by everything around her. They'd bundle her warmly and take her with them on shorter tasks, letting her experience the ranch even as a baby. She's going to grow up tough, Clara observed one afternoon, watching Hope study a cow with serious concentration. Ranch life will do that. Like her mother. And her father. You're pretty tough yourself now, city boy. Nathaniel looked down at his calloused hands, his weathered face, and thought about the man he'd been when he first stepped off that train. That person seemed like a stranger now, separated not just by time, but by fundamental transformation. He'd been remade by this land, this woman, this life. I barely remember who I was before, he admitted. Good. That man was running from something. This man is running towards something. That's a better way to live. As Hope's first birthday approached, they stood together one evening on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in familiar colors. Hope was asleep inside, worn out from a day of exploration under their watchful eyes. The ranch was quiet. the work done for the day, and the future stretched ahead with all its uncertainty and promise. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked suddenly. "Answering that advertisement? Coming out here to a life so different from what you knew?" Nathaniel considered the question seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. He thought about his former life, the social performances, the hollow relationships, the pursuit of status and approval. Then he thought about this life, the honest work, the real partnership, the love built on shared struggle and mutual respect. "Not for a single second," he said. "This life, this place, you and hope, you're everything I never knew I needed. Everything real I'd been missing without knowing what was absent. Even though it's hard, especially because it's hard, the difficulty is what makes it meaningful. Every challenge we overcome together, every crisis we survive, every small victory we achieve, it all matters in ways nothing in my old life ever did." Clara leaned against him, and they stood in comfortable silence watching the day fade into night. The stars emerged one by one, scattered across the vast Wyoming sky in patterns that had guided travelers and dreamers for millennia. "I'm glad you stayed," Clara said finally. "Glad you didn't run when things got difficult. Glad you loved me enough to wait until I could love you back. I'd wait forever for you. Luckily, you didn't have to." Inside, Hope began to fuss, and they both smiled. "That's our cue," Clara said. "Our cue for another sleepless night. Worth it, though. Absolutely worth it." They went inside together, partners in every sense, ready to face whatever came next. The ranch demanded constant work, children demanded constant attention, and life promised constant challenges. But they'd face it all together, building their future one day at a time through honest labor and stubborn love. Years later, when Nathaniel was older and his dark hair had gone silver, when Hope had grown into a capable young woman who ran the ranch with her mother's competence and her father's strategic thinking, he would sometimes stand on that same porch and remember the man who'd stepped off the train with nothing but shame and desperation driving him forward. That man had been looking for escape. What he'd found instead was home. The Wyoming Territory had stripped away every pretense, tested every weakness, and demanded transformation or destruction. Nathaniel had chosen transformation, and in doing so, he'd found not just survival but purpose, not just work but meaning, not just partnership but love. On his last evening, as he sat on the porch with Clara beside him, both of them weathered by years of hard living but unbroken, he looked out at the valley they'd defended together and felt complete peace. The land stretched away into shadow and distance, eternal and indifferent, beautiful and harsh. It had taken everything they could give and returned just enough to keep them fighting, and they'd won, not through dominance or conquest, but through adaptation and respect, through learning to work with the land rather than against it, through building something that would outlast them both. "No regrets?" Clara asked, echoing their conversation from decades earlier. Nathaniel took her hand, weathered and strong, and held it gently. "Not one." "Good. Because I'm not giving you back even if you did." He laughed, the sound carried away on the evening wind. "I wouldn't go even if you tried to send me. Stubborn man, stubborn woman. We match. Perfectly." As the sun set on another day, on another year, on a life well lived through the honest work and hard-won love, they sat together in the home they'd built and the life they'd created. The future would belong to Hope and whatever children she might have, but the foundation they'd laid would hold strong. Because some things, once built on bedrock and truth, could withstand any storm. The land had witnessed their arrival as strangers, their transformation into partners, and their evolution into family. It would witness their passing someday, as it had witnessed countless others. But what they'd built together, the ranch, the legacy, the love that had grown from pragmatic arrangement into something profound and lasting, that would endure. That evening, as stars emerged and the valley filled with familiar darkness, Nathaniel understood something fundamental about the life he'd found. He'd come to Wyoming running from failure, and he'd discovered that failure was just transformation wearing a different mask. Every ending held the seed of new beginning. Every loss contained the possibility of finding something better. He'd lost everything once, And in losing it, he'd found the only things that truly mattered: purpose, partnership, home, and love. Stubborn, practical, honest love that worked beside you in the dirt and held your hand through the darkness and built something real from shared struggle and mutual respect. That was enough. That was everything. That was the life worth living, the only legacy that truly mattered. As Clara leaned her head on his shoulder and they watched the familiar stars wheel overhead, Nathaniel felt gratitude so deep it approached reverence, for the land that had tested and transformed him, for the woman who'd given him a chance when he had nothing to offer but willingness to work, for the daughter who carried their combined legacy forward into the future, for the life they'd built together, one day at a time, one challenge at a time, one small victory at a time, until the accumulation of all those days and challenges and victories became something magnificent. A ranch, a family, a home. The heart that had fled high society had learned what it meant to stay. And in staying, in fighting, in choosing every day to build rather than run, it had found what it had been seeking all along. Not escape, not hiding, not forgetting, but belonging. Purpose. Love earned through honest work and shared sacrifice. That was the true fortune of the male